roundtable, we hope to identify the impact, challenges, and perhaps opportunities posed by these arrangements on the future pathway of the AfCFTA. In their opening remarks on day one of this event, leadership from ECA and the AfCFTA Secretariat keenly observed that the AfCFTA does not operate and will not operate in a vacuum. There are other existing structures and frameworks that require broad policy coherence and coordination. Also, to pick up on their guiding principle, let's use this roundtable discussion as a free and neutral space in which to engage in a serious and candid dialogue. I'm now pleased to introduce the members of our panel. Our principal presenter, Dr. San Bilal, is a senior executive and head of program at the European Center for Development Policy Management. He heads the trade, investment, and finance team of ECDPM's Economic and Agricultural Transformation Program. His current activities focus on the structural transformation dynamics in Africa and financing for development, and include projects on trade and development, sustainable global value chains, Ipas, of course, and the dynamics of regional integration processes in Africa. He will be joined by the following discussants who will offer reflections and commentary on his presentation. Professor Bartholomew Arma is currently the director of the Macroeconomics and Governance Division of ECA. Prior to joining the ECA, he was a tenured professor at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. He recently served as the policy and planning coordinator of the UN Secretary General's transition team for the reform of the development system. He was also chief of development planning in ECA's Macroeconomics and Governance Division, where he spearheaded the design of ECA's integrated planning and reporting tool. Syed Atia. He has progressive work experience as an international trade practitioner. He has a deep conviction of the importance of trade as an engine for inclusive and sustainable development. He has a firm belief that economic integration, industrialization, efficient internal infrastructure, trade facilitation, e-commerce, and digitalization will be key pillars for Africa's trade promotion. Then we have Professor Alwale Ogenkola. He is the current head of Department of Economics in the University of Ibadan, Nigeria. He is the director of trade policy research and the training program of the Department of Economics, and he was the lead consultant for the ECA project on the 2015 Economic Report on Africa, Industrializing Through Trade. We also are happy to have Cristina Miranda Gonzalez. Currently, she's working at the European Commission in the Directorate General for Trade as head of unit in charge of African, Caribbean, and Pacific overseas countries and territories. Previously, she was the DG in Agriculture and Rural Development as deputy head of unit on global issues and relations with ACP countries. We are also lucky to have Benedict Widenhofer. He's the advisor at the International Relations Department at Business Europe, the European Industry and Employers Federation, representing 40 national industry and employers federations from 35 European countries. The topics he deals with include the EU trade and investment relations with the UK, China, and the Andean community and Africa and Caribbean, as well as the implementation of EU free trade agreements and EU development policy. So all to say, all of our panelists are very busy bees, but they have made the time to join us today. So having said all of that, over to you, San, for your presentation. You will have 20 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Osmina. This is really an honor and a privilege to be part of this distinguished panel and this extremely valuable roundtable that is organized. We had already in the previous days very interesting discussions, and already some of the insights were provided around the questions. And let me share some of my own perspectives in a quick manner on some of the interactions between the economic partnership agreements and perhaps even more broadly the European FTAs with African countries. There's EU FTAs for North Africa, and the relationship with the African CFTA. Let me start perhaps by saying how fantastic, and I think we would all agree that concluding the African CFTA and starting the implementation is just a huge achievement. And I think that many have doubted, especially external actors have doubted that the Pan-African ambitions could materialize, and now we see it's there. And so I think this is no little achievement. It is a huge free trade agreement, unparalleled, and so really congratulations for all those that have managed to get there. So that was for the good news. Of course, the bad news is that any free trade agreement negotiators will tell you that the really hard work is not negotiating the trade agreements, but it's the implementation. And so that is really where all the efforts now have to go in terms of how do you implement this fantastic agreement. The second element I would like to stress perhaps is that, of course, here we will focus a lot on the trade and investment dimension. But I think the African CFTA is more than a trade agreement, free trade agreement. It is really a strategic political agreement to re-energize the Pan-African integration. And I think this is the way it should be seen, with trade and free trade just as a tool, as an instrument to achieve this Pan-African integration, which is in fact for the purpose of uplifting the development of Africa. So it is first and foremost a political ambition, which is very important to achieve, and trade is this instrument to do so. So an effective trade opening is what would be a sign of it is working at the technical level, but the purpose is really more broadly to stimulate beyond the specific respect of the rules of the trade agreements. The objective is really to stimulate trade and investments, and in order to enhance the production capacity in Africa, to be able to produce more at the local level, to develop regional value chains, national and regional and cross-regional value chains, and to create jobs for better life for all African people. So it is an agreement for the people, as been also mentioned in the previous couple of days, and I think that's what we should keep in mind. And it is in that respect that we should consider, also the interaction with the external partners of the African Union, and not just the trade angle. The second element is that the African CFTA should not be perceived as, either in the simple dichotomy of either we trade among Africans or we trade with others, but as a zero-sum game. And that's what, of course, trade agreements can lead to some trade diversion. But what we can see is that, and in particular in the case of the African CFTA, is that the ambition is to trade, to produce more at the African level, to uplift to go up the added value chain in Africa, and therefore be able to both for within Africa and with the rest of the world. So it's not an agenda for an isolation of Africa, but for Africa to be stronger in the international arena and to develop itself. So we should look at the synergies and complementarities with the other trading partners and try to focus on the opportunities and, of course, mitigate any possible negative impact. But we should not think about it's either the African CFTA or free trade agreement with other partners. At the purely technical level, from a trade perspective, also the African CFTA is not a custom union. A custom union does require a common trade policy. This is not yet the case for the African Union. So perhaps before thinking about, already the African Union being a custom union, let's focus on implementing the African CFTA and ensure the compatibility with other free trade agreements. So, in other words, it's about creating a continental market at the Pan-African level in an integrated world economy. And when I was preparing this, it reminded me a bit of the discussion of the European own integration, where you remember there were fears when there was a discussion of the European single markets that there would be a fortress Europe. And to some extent, sometimes when I hear some of the comments about the African CFTA, that we should have really only the African preference and what should be the relationship with the rest of the world. It's not about a fortress Africa. It's about an Africa open to the rest of the world, but that is much stronger to be open to the rest of the world. And that's what we want to see. Now, in this context, the EU is a really major actor. It's a major, of course, global actor, and has been recalled already at the beginning of this webinar 2 days ago. It's a major trade investments aid actor globally, but also for Africa. But it's also a major regional integration actor. And in that sense, the project of Europe is quite unique, and it's a political actor at the same time, and an increasingly important one. And because of its history and its own emergence, the EU is very keen on regional integration processes around the world, and has been a very strong advocate and supporter of African integration in particular. It has been doing so by supporting, by having really dedicated programs to support regional economic communities and regional integration processes, both at the national level and at the regional level, trying to combine the two dimensions. And it is in fact the main provider of regional aid for trade at the international level. So it is really trying to put some of its, not only in terms of the rhetoric, but also in terms of the facts and the support. Now, in doing so, probably it's in Africa that we see the best example of this element. But this is across the globe approach of the EU that has also, trying to pursue free trade agreements and trade relationship with the other regional groupings. So they have done that, of course, in the context of economic partnership agreements to support regional integration, but also because it was a large group of countries, and so there was no other options, I think, than to try to negotiate in a collective manner. But it has done so also with Central America. It is just concluded an agreement with Mercosur. It has done so with the Western Balkans, and I've tried so far unsuccessfully, but that was also the ambition in Asia with the ASEAN. So there is a general trend to think about how Europe can work at the regional level. And in that sense, Europe is both able to draw on its own experience of regional integration and what are some of the hurdles they had to be confronted with, but also perhaps the relationship with other regional groupings is also perhaps a good source of information for the relationship between Europe and Africa. Now, in the context of the economic partnership agreements, let's be honest, that has been a rocky ride, to say the least. And for those like me old enough to remember the genesis of these negotiations from the start, many of the African, Caribbean, Pacific countries were not very keen on having these free trade agreements put in place, but they were in a sense forced, or some of them felt forced to do so if they wanted to maintain preferential market access to the EU. And so in that respect, the history of normally when you conclude a free trade agreement, it's because you want to gain better market access in your partner country. In this case, for many countries, it was a question of preserving market access to the EU, and they had, in order to do so, they had to open up their own market. And although it has been, the negotiations were framed in a regional context, I've been tried to frame in a regional context. It has been perceived, at least, as trying to divide and split Africa. There was no negotiations at the Pan-African level. which was initially proposed also by the African Union. And even among some regional groupings, the coherence of some of the regional economic communities have not been respected. So, that is also partly due to the fact that African countries are normally belonging to more than one regional grouping, what has been sometimes referred to as the spaghetti ball and overlapping of African regional groupings. And one should remember, again, I started by saying that the African CFTA is not just about trade, it's a political strategic agenda. It's the same at the sub-regional level. So perhaps it has also put some tensions to some African countries that, almost you have to decide to which regional grouping you belong to. Remember the case of Tanzania that was was asked to choose between SADC or East African Community in terms of the Ipas they wanted to belong to. While in fact, for different both economic and political reasons, a country might have very good reasons to belong to different regional groupings. So the trades, one has said it is asked for rationalization of the regional integration, has put some of the dilemma in terms of some of the choices that the countries were facing. Also, the level of preferences and the type of preferences were different. So some countries, were pushed to think about an economic partnership agreements and free trade agreement. Others were very satisfied with the everything but arms and the generalized system of preference of the EU, having already duty-free, quota-free market access to the EU under that scheme, and so little interest in negotiating a free trade agreements. Others might have considered the GSP or the GSP plus as an alternative. So there were diverging interests that existed among countries and also among sectors in terms of how far they wanted to see a free trade agreement or an economic partnership agreement with Europe, not just as a market access tool, but perhaps also as an engine for their own domestic reforms. And so because of these different interests among countries, that has definitely created tensions among different regional partners of one same region. So we should not hide about these, these tensions that have been there. Another issue that has come up with the economic partnership agreement was to say we need to have first the integration and the rules set at the African level, at the regional level, and then once we know what are the rules that we are comfortable with, then we will agree to rules with the partners. And I sympathize with that kind of argument, but there is still so. That kind of element would call for sequencing. You first do the African integration, and then only you do agreements with the rest of the world. The problem is the question of timing, because setting up their own regional integration process is time-consuming, and we could see that even the EPA negotiations have started in over 20 years ago. And now, or 20 years ago, and now we see, the African CFTA only getting into place. So 20 years later, and that think about the world at the early 2000s was a very different global world that it is today. So there's a question is, yes, in principle, it would be fantastic to have African deciding their rules first, and when they are ready, only to negotiate and agree with the other partners in the rest of the world. But the problem is that the rest of the world doesn't stand still waiting for Africa to get ready. So there's an issue that sometimes you need to jump and try to see if you want to make agreements with the foreign partners, even when you don't have necessarily collectively agreed rules at the Pan-African level. And we have seen that partly in the context of the economic partnership agreement. Of course, there's an element of power game, who comes first, who is setting the scene and so on. But I think this question of time is very important. And what we have also seen with the economic partnership agreements quite nicely is the difficulties for the partners of the EU to negotiate as a group, as a bloc. And for the EU, they have the institutional setting to do that. They do have a large experience of doing so, and the competencies for trade are squarely with the European Commission. So it has the apparatus to do so. But what we have seen in the case of Africa, and even in the case of Customs Union, is that to negotiate, to have counterparts to negotiate at the regional level is not easy. And that's an important lesson, because while in the context of the African CFTA, coordination would be a very good idea, to try to, even before having a custom union at the Pan-African level, to try to behave like a custom union and have common positions on all type of any trade negotiations with a third party that an African country would like to engage in, to say, well, we need to have a common position at the Pan-African level. That would be extremely difficult. And it's not, even if the principle is nice, in practice, it is very difficult. Now, let's consider some of the positive dynamics that Ipas have created. I think that it has definitely put the issue of regional integration, even for Africa, really much at the center. And the EU is concerned about the implication, even if it had arguably some negative effect on regional integration in Africa. That was even these kind of arguments that you're splitting regions or you're undermining our regional integration. It hit a sensitive nerve from the European side. That is really concerned about it. Now, if we look at the situation of some other countries, we don't necessarily see that there is such a concern by other actors. The US is happy to negotiate free trade agreements, if not on a regional basis, on an individual basis, not asking too many questions. In the context, I know that the UK is just trying to set up its trade agreements, but has not a real proper trade policy in place yet. We heard that yesterday at the end of the day, but still, we heard discussions of the UK, bragging that they could have a free trade agreement with Nigeria, obviously with little consideration for the regional integration processes. The same with Kenya. So, in that sense, the EU is concerned about that. The second is that the EPA negotiations have really created a sense of urgency, I think, on the African side also about their own integration process. So it has been, if it's even sometimes in opposition to the EU, it has been a rallying call. And I'm sure that even, some of the elements of the African CFTAs, we could find some of the traces back into, the reaction to the way the EU was engaging with Africa and saying it would be better if we were more strongly integrated. What we can definitely see in the context of the EPA negotiations is that in West Africa, the need to come with a regional liberalization schedule was requiring, to some extent, for Coherence to have a common external tariff for the whole ECOWAS and not only UMOA. So, any insider knows that this process of negotiation with the EU has put some urgency in the need of establishing a common external tariff for West Africa. And it's only after there was the adoption of the common external tariff for ECOWAS that the EPA negotiations for West Africa could be concluded. So, arguably, the elements of EPAs have also helped to some extent the regional integration focus, and also in terms, of course, of capacity building. For sure, for some trade negotiation dimensions, so there's a learning effect, but also in terms of the implementation and the regional integration. So, a long story short, EPAs have definitely left mixed feelings. Some people are still feeling hurt. We see some of the same processes, by the way, in North Africa. The negotiations of free trade agreements with North African countries was easier, but the discussion of deep and comprehensive free trade agreement is much more difficult. And if for those following what is happening in North Africa, we hear some of the same arguments that we have heard under the economic partnership agreements. So my feeling, and for being an old guy that has been part of all this discussion, is that while one can understand some old resentments and there's a need to learn from the lessons, there's also sometimes a need to move forward and forget about the past tension. And we've seen some countries that have been reluctant in the past to negotiate a free trade agreement with the EU, like Angola, for instance, coming on board. And we see some countries now willing to negotiate deeper agreements. So again, there's a diversity of perspectives. Some have absolutely no interest to negotiate an FTA with the EU. Others have an interest to negotiate deeper. And the art of the game is to try to to balance these various instruments. Now, what is something that is quite striking, if we look, for instance, at I was looking at the recent impact assessments for the in the context of the ESA countries, East and Southern Africa, or if we look at the impact assessment in the Caribbean that has been done. So of course, these studies have some of their weaknesses and so on. But overall, if we look at the studies that were there, and if we compare with the tensions that were around the EPAs, and the arguments, both from those that were saying EPAs will really help reform the countries and the regions and will help to do a big leap forward, and others that were saying they would be a catastrophe, it will doom the economies and so on. Sure, they are not fully implemented, so we have to see what would happen. But the general assessment is that they are not as bad as feared, and they are not as good as hoped. And so perhaps we have made a bit too much of the economic partnership agreements, and we should not be so focused on it, but be considerate of how could they be helpful. The other general lessons that we can see from the economic partnership, the lesson we can see both from the economic partnership agreements, but even more broadly on FTAs, and in particular FTAs that are concluded with the developing countries. I'm part of a EU research program, Horizon 2020, where with academics, where we focus on what are some of the lessons of EU trade policy. And one of the elements is that while we hear and we see that trade negotiators and sometimes politicians and various actors thinks that all the issues can be solved by increasing the number of clauses and reference into a trade agreement. So you have an inflation of provisions in trade agreements, and thinking that because we put more provisions in this trade agreement, de facto they will have an impact. What we see in practice is that the FTAs are quite often a framework for trade and a framework for reforms, but they can help in that respect. But they have also very much their limitation, and their success in catalyzing these reforms and transformations are very much linked to other policies and other measures that are taken next to the trade policy. And I think that's a very important lesson, both for the implementation of the economic partnership agreements, but definitely for the African CFTA. So there is really a need to think not just about implementing just the rules of the African CFTA, and think because the African CFTA is nicely crafted, you will have a good implementation, but you have to think about what are the type of measures that are there. And again, the African CFTA is, as I was saying, a political strategic agenda. It's about development and job creation. So in that sense, I would say the Africans are much more advanced than many other FTAs, in the sense that from the conception, the African CFTA is perceived as this tool for a transformation of Africa and not as an end in itself. And I think I really would like to stress that element, because this is really important to have the progress on the African CFTA and the synergies with the economic partnership agreement. So what does it mean? Sure, we can think about how to improve some of the rules and coherence of the rules and so on. And so, for instance, issues on harmonizations of some of the rules of origins for the EU FTAs, the Ipas, the African CFTA, and so on. One could be, there is perhaps some work that could be done there, and on some other trade rules that's, there's an issue of are they compatible and could that work properly. But there's a lot of synergies that could be found. Think about in terms of trade implementation. Think about, for instance, of trade facilitation. In trade facilitation, it's a commitment that is done at the multilateral level in the context of the World Trade Organization with the trade facilitation agreement. You have also, commitment to support capacity building to help implementing this agreement. You do have clauses in EPAs or in other EU FTAs that include trade facilitation, including commitments to support trade facilitation. And you do have similar clauses in the African CFTA. So if we're thinking about how do you create, and in the context of the Ipas, because there are regional agreements, there is also trade facilitation, not just between the EU and the African and one African country, but also facilitating trade within the region. And and there is, of course, in addition, trade facilitation is also an element of many of the regional groupings, sub-regional integration processes that is also there. So think about the synergies between these initiatives that you can take, the lessons you can learn from one to the other, and how you could construct and how you could build on the supports, in this case of the EU, the external support you get to say, well, we want trade facilitation to be able to address all our concerns, including African CFTA, and not just in the context of the EPAs. And guess what? Europe is very much interested in thinking like that. The same in terms of productive capacity and the development of sustainable value chains for job creation. This is at the heart of the agenda of the trade, but also the investment agenda and the aid agenda of the European Union. They are talking about how can we promote, how can we identify value chains, not just with Europe, but also local value chains and regional value chains where there will be opportunities for job creation, where there could be, of course, perhaps connection with Europe, but what are those that are the most promising? What are those that would require support? How could we connect better to these one and support them better? So these elements is both relevant in the context of the, in the context of the Ipas, where you do have some Ipa implementation plans that do focus on this dimension, and in the African CFTA. So what are the synergies? Don't think in terms of silos, think in terms of what are the kind of key sectors and key elements and key value chains that you want to support, and then use the entry point with the donor that is the most helpful. But don't think try not to differentiate between African CFTA and then you have a program that ignoring what is done, for instance, in the context of the EPA, and the same way the other way around. There are a lot of elements here. The creation of a Pan-African market is really perceived by many, I follow the debate in Europe. There's much more, I would say, there's much more enthusiasm by the private sector in Europe about the African CFTA than there's been about EPAs. The reality is that, of course, perhaps on services in South Africa, but in general, for goods, there's not much interest by the private sector, or there's not been that strong interest by the private sector in Europe for the economic partnership agreements. Not so many strong calls of it's beyond some specific commodities. But I think the private sector in Europe sees, and we'll hear Business Europe, Benedict talking about it, but there's much more interest in saying, well, if there's a larger market in Africa, where we can move freely, where the rules are a bit harmonized, when we are not constantly restricted from small markets from each of the countries, this makes it much more attractive to do investments, to do the production even by European in one country, to be able to serve a more regional markets and so on. So there's a lot of opportunities for trade creation instead of and investment creation instead of diversion. And in that sense, that would be very interesting. And when you need to develop your production capacity and so on, if you have other investors, outside investors, this is very useful. The same some considerations about investment facilitation, and it's not just about goods, but also about services. This is really useful to have such kind of facilitation at the Pan-African level and also more regional markets in terms of services. And that would also be of interest for European traders and investors. So the big lesson is don't think about the silo approach. I remember at the beginning of the, when the conclusions of the Ipas, the recommendation was to create EPA implementation units into various ministries and so on to coordinate exactly what you want to do. It's good to coordinate, but one of the concerns is that an EPA implementation unit might then get disconnected from the rest of the activities of the country in terms of trade and investment. So yeah, sure, think about EPA implementation, but try to enshrine that into the African CFTA and regional integration processes in an integrated manner. So for the advice from Europe and what I also talk to people at the Commission and European member states doing some training on aid for trade and so on, is to say, since the political traction is not under the Ipas, but it's really under the African CFTA, think about the African CFTA for donors, and that's definitely my message also to Europe, about a major entry point for your trade-related and investment support measures. And because of the connections I've been mentioning, it will also be, it can be a win-win type of engagement for Europe, but you will have probably larger political traction if you think about the African CFTA to support. And because of the Pan-African endeavor around the implementation of the African CFTA, it is for donors. So donors always saying, give me a program or give me a local ownership about what is done. So, and definitely the EU is pushing for that, and the EU member states. So the African CFTA is exactly this kind of entry point for trade and investment that one is looking for. The last point that I would like to mention is that in terms of the external relations, it's true for the FTAs with Europe, but it's even more broadly with the other partners. But in fact, Europe has many regional and bilateral FTAs or Ipas with African countries. Now, I think what is very important for the African Union countries, and where the African Union could really play a very useful role, or the African CFTA Secretariat, is to help coordinate the sharing of experiences of what are the opportunities that countries that have an FTA with Europe, what are the opportunities that they have identified, and what are the lessons of implementation? What are the bottlenecks they have encountered? How do they overcome these bottlenecks? There is the APAs are there also to be reviewed on a regular basis. So is there an exchange of experiences among countries at the African level? Do they can by sharing this experience of what they have seen in their either own integration or in the implementation of an EPA, do they see perhaps, can they anticipate some of the problems that will also emerge in the implementation of the African CFTA? Are there some lessons? So I think that trying to share, to create a community at the African level, to share and to be able to respond to what is done is really an important aspect also of this synergy. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, San. San's presentation provided, I think, a very solid backdrop to focus our discussion. The sensibilities around Ipas is very difficult to capture in 20 or so minutes, but like a true pro, he has managed to hit all the high notes. We already have some burning questions coming in from the audience, but allow me to carry over first the three themes from San's presentation for the purposes of hearing from our discussants. And then we will definitely make time at the end for an opportunity to invite questions from the audience. Number one, I think one of the main themes, obviously, from the presentation was setting the scene. Origins of the EPA model, vis-a-vis African regional integration goals and ambition. I think it was very important to hear where we started and the origins of the pathway that it created and why we have these challenges and opportunities today. The second theme, insights and reflections on the agreement, so the AfCFTA, and policy space for creating new synergies. This also involved, I think, what we all refer to as smart sequencing. So what are the pathways? What are the processes and opportunities for trying to create new synergies, but also taking advantage of and tapping into existing structures and preconditions? Maintaining current policy space versus creating new policy space. This, again, as Sam mentioned, is critical. Why? Because of the timing sensitivities. So we hear there is always this sense of urgency to make a difference, to make changes. However, what is clear from the presentation is that what will be required as a key policy recommendation is a requisite roadmap, a roadmap which is purposive, intentional, and forward-looking. This is going to be a very difficult enterprise. The third theme, well, as always, taking stock. Where are we at and where do we want to land? So the prospects and challenges for implementation of the AfCFTA comes into play here. And having said all that, let's then get right to the commentary and reflections of our discussants. I will invite each, according to the program, to take the floor, and you will each have 10 minutes. So shall I start with Christina? You have the floor.
Thanks a lot. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Great. Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, Rosmina, Sam, distinguished co-panelists. I would like to first thank UNECA for inviting DigiTrade of the European Commission to this seminar. I am delighted to be part of this particular panel focused on the European Union Economic Partnership Agreements with Africa and their implications for the African Continental FTA implementation. And I'm very glad to take the floor just after Sam. I very much appreciated his forward-looking presentation on Ipas. So let me recall that Her Excellency Birgit Markussen's presentation yesterday highlighted the European Union's political, financial, and technical support to the African Continental FTA. As she announced yesterday, I want to go into greater detail about the contribution that the European Union trade policy can make to the African Continental FTA. So you may know that the European Commission has proposed to step up our engagement with Africa under the Trade Policy Review communication that has been recently published on the 18th of February. This communication aims at boosting political dialogue and cooperation with the African Union and its members and the smooth implementation of the African Continental FTA. This should also include engagement with the private sector and promoting common standards in Africa to enhance regional and continental integration. We will continue to create new opportunities for African and European businesses and strengthen our ties and our resilience to future shocks. The European Union's trade agreements with Africa offer the prospects of closer economic integration on the continent. In sub-Saharan Africa, we see the economic partnership agreements as building blocks of the African Continental FTA and the EU-African trade relations. They can be building blocks because of the objectives, the tools, and the challenges are very similar. I will start with the objectives. The African Continental FTA is an African agenda, but it is pursuing objectives that the European Union itself has cherished for a long time. I am referring to sustainable development and inclusive growth, enhanced trade and investment, notably within Africa, economic integration, value addition, and industrialization. What the African Continental FTA and the economic partnership agreements have in common is that neither see trade liberalization as an end goal in itself, as Sam was saying. We see it rather as a tool for sustainable development and economic transformation and reform. My second argument is that the African Continental FTA and the economic partnership agreements are employing very similar tools and instruments. I think it is an historical fact that the Africa's trade agreements with the European Union have brought trade tools and expertise that African countries and regions have been able to use now to build their own African Continental FTA. The economic partnership agreements have also brought relevant aid for trade and capacity building, which has also benefited the African Continental FTA. The technical tools of the economic partnership agreements and other agreements with the European Union include tariffs, product exclusions, rules of origin, trade defense instrument, and even dispute settlement mechanism. In negotiating the African Continental FTA, all these issues I have enumerated have been under discussion partly on the basis of the expertise and experience gained with the implementation of the Ipas with the European Union. Let me add that the generous access to the European market under its trade agreements with Africa is boosting the competitiveness of African countries and companies engaged in continental integration. Economic partnership agreements in particular offer free access to our markets. And under Ipas, market access was not only preserved, but also upgraded to full free access even for non-LDC countries. My third and last point is about common challenges. The similarity in the challenges facing the African Continental FTA and the Economic Partnership Agreements is striking. Let me mention three of them. Firstly, the capacity constraints that have already been mentioned by Sam. We believe that boosted administrative, productive, and trading capacities are needed to implement trade agreements correctly and to reap their full potential. Secondly, neither the African Continental FTA nor the Economic Partnership Agreements are a simple trade liberalization agenda. Nevertheless, African governments have sometimes been reluctant to use a trade liberalization tool to achieve their objectives and economic growth and reform. They have also sometimes struggled to explain to stakeholders how these tools fit into a strategy of diversification and value addition. Thirdly, both the African Continental Free Trade Area and the Economic Partnership Agreements are trying to build on sub-regional integration initiatives in Africa. Where there are underlying tensions and imperfections, these also affect the functioning and prospects of the African Continental FTA and the Ipas. I will not deny that this has sometimes stood in the way of Ipas reaching their full potential as planned. On the regional IPA groupings, and I am making reference to the presentation of Sam, I would like to underline that it is true that these IPA groupings do not coincide always with the African Union regional economic communities. But the most important point I want to make is that IPA groupings were chosen by the ACP partners and that the regional integration initiatives they themselves proposed and pursued. Let me conclude by saying that recently the Organization of African, Caribbean and Pacific States and the European Union have just initialed the Post-Cotonou Framework Agreement. The Africa Protocol states that the African states and the European Union see the Economic Partnership Agreements and the African Continental Free Trade Area as complementary and mutually supportive. For me, this is not just a strong political statement, but it is a work program to foster such synergies between the African Continental FTA and Ipas. I have suggested some answers to the question of complementarity and synergies of Ipas as genuine building blocks or toolkits of African continental integration. I very much welcome, Rosmina, the second theme you have brought to our attention, because I want to flag the need to tap into the potential which is offered by existing structures, and IPA is one of them. I think we have to tap into the potential of IPAs being a building block for the African Continental FTA. So I would like very much to discuss these issues with you and with other African stakeholders. This is one of the topics where the European Commission is seeking to deepen the dialogue, and I would like to thank the organizers of this event for the opportunity that has given me to make this presentation. Many thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Christina. Now the floor goes to Benedict. Benedict, please enlighten us. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you, Rosmina, and good morning and good afternoon to everybody. First of all, I would also like to thank ECHA for inviting us. It's really a privilege to be on this distinguished panel. Now, as Rosmina mentioned at the beginning, I work for Business Europe, the European Business and Employers Federation that represents 40 national industry and employers federations from 35 European countries. As we've heard at the beginning, the European Union is Africa's main trade partner and the leading source of FDI inflows on the continent. And in recent years, interest in trade and investment opportunities in Africa has grown amongst European companies, whilst many African governments have undertaken ambitious policies to improve their investment climates. And in this regard, the African Continental Free Trade Area, more than any other single factor, has the potential to boost Africa's economic growth and promote industrialization, combat extreme poverty in the long term, and improve the investment climate. And as Sun mentioned in his presentation, the European business community is very enthusiastic about it indeed, and it sees an enormous potential in this initiative and follows its implementation closely. Overcoming the fragmentation of African markets for trading goods and services and for investment will make a major contribution towards improving the investment climate in African countries and towards promoting investments in value-adding sectors, including from European companies. The new Africa Europe Alliance for Sustainable Investment and Jobs, which was first announced by former Commission President Juncker in 2018, and which will at some point in the future become a joint EU-Africa strategy as well, and which aims to deepen economic and trade relations between our continents, acknowledges fully the importance of the AfCFTA and pledges to support it. And it is indeed key, also from a European business perspective, that the EU uses all the tools at its disposal to support the African continental integration process while boosting economic relations between our continents. In this regard, European business considers the economic partnership agreements and the association agreements and deep and comprehensive FTAs between the EU and African countries and regions as important instruments. Because if they are implemented properly, they can be building blocks both to free a trade between Europe and Africa and to increased economic integration on the continent. And there are several ways in which EPAs can be complementary to the AfCFTA. And we've heard many of them already. On the one hand, EPAs can help integrate African countries into European value chains while encouraging producers to source many of their inputs in Africa. To showcase this, let us look at the hypothetical example of a European producer of machinery that sets up a production plant in an African region at some time in the future, in a few years, in order to supply from there both the European market and the African market. And let us assume that the region in question, where the machinery producer establishes a production plant, has an EPA with the EU and is part of the Continental Free Trade Area. Now, thanks to the Economic Partnership Agreement, the machinery producer has a stable duty-free access to the EU market, and flexible rules of origin under the EPA allow the company to source its inputs from the entire EPA region while maintaining preferential access to the EU. At the same time, the EPA makes it cheaper to import certain inputs from Europe by reducing or eliminating relevant tariffs. And that is particularly important in cases where these inputs are not available locally. And this, of course, makes it easier for industrial sectors that have not been historically present in a given country or region to start producing there. Now, although it's possible to source parts of the inputs from Europe, the machinery producer also has a strong incentive to source as much as possible from African countries because of the AfCFTA, because if the machinery producer wants to benefit from the AfCFTA and to benefit from lower or reduced or eliminated tariffs to export to the rest of Africa, needs to comply with rules of origin under the AfCFTA. And while rules of origin differ from product to product, they often prescribe that at least 50% of the value added of a product need to come from the exporting country or region. This, along with the stable access to both the European and African market, makes it beneficial for the producer to invest in long-term relationships with local suppliers and to also train them to meet its standards in the medium and long term, and thereby also increase the network of local suppliers that it has on the continent. And this is one way in which the EPAs can help integrate European and African value chains and be complementary to the AfCFTA. Another way in which EPAs can act as building blocks to continental free trade relates to the realities of 21st century trade. Because as you know, much of contemporary industrial production takes place within international production networks that allow producers to specialize in specific niches and obtain economies of scale that make them competitive internationally. And coordinating such value chains that extend over several countries and regions require the continuous two-way flow of goods, of people, and of information, as well as assurances that companies will be treated fairly in the different jurisdictions they are active in. And modern FTAs try to cater for these needs through some deeper disciplines that focus in part on what happens behind the border of a country and not only at the customs for trading goods. All EPAs table such disciplines, which include, for example, trade and services, investment, competition, intellectual property, trade facilitation, and so on, for future negotiations. And more recently, the EU also added investment facilitation or trade and sustainable development to the list of issues that could be included if partner regions in Africa agreed to deepen their EPA. Now, once negotiated and implemented, many of these deeper provisions would not only help benefit companies from Europe, the EPA region in question, but any foreign operator active in the region. This in turn would also help companies from other African regions to do business in the African region in question, and thereby it could contribute to closer economic ties on the continent. Now, let me illustrate this with a few examples. If, for example, a country commits in an EPA to opening or binding services sector, then the country often applies this opening or this binding of the level of openness of the services sector not only companies of partner countries under the agreement, but a most favored nation basis, so that also other foreign companies benefit from it. Regarding investment facilitation, San already mentioned it. If a country commits to investment facilitation, for example, to improve transparency and predictability for foreign investors and to streamline related administrative processes, companies from any country will benefit from this increased transparency and these lighter administrative processes. If a country commits to respect certain standards that ensure fair competition between domestic and foreign companies and to refrain from certain practices that distort level playing field, all companies active in the region will benefit. And similarly, many of the commitments taken in intellectual property or trade facilitation chapters of modern FTAs are implemented in a way that benefit economic operators from any country that is active in that region. And Sun said that only adding more provisions alone is not enough, and that's indeed true. And that's why also the technical assistance aspect is very important, since the EU usually provides technical assistance and capacity building alongside negotiations, but also in order to help partner countries implement these their commitments. And if there is a strong interest from both sides to implement these commitments, they can be very beneficial, not only for companies from the EPA region and Europe, but more broadly, any companies active in the region. Now, for these reasons that are highlighted, EPAs and the Continental Free Trade Agreement are by no means mutually exclusive from a business perspective, but rather EPAs can complement the regional and continental integration processes in Africa while helping deepen economic ties with the EU. As building blocks for continental trade in Africa and for a long-term perspective of a continent-to-continent free trade agreement between the European Union and Africa, can in this way make a major contribution towards improving the investment climate in Africa and towards promoting Euro-African value chains. And this may be of increased relevance in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, because in the coming years, some European companies will seek to diversify their supply chains to reduce the risk of future disruptions. And this creates opportunities for countries in Africa and in the European neighborhood. So that makes this issue even more relevant now. I'll stop here, and I'll of course be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Benedict, and thank you for bringing the business community voice, or voices plural, to the table today. Bartholomew, the floor is now yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you to the panelists for the insightful presentations. I'd like to start where the first presenters, on one of the key points raised by the initial presenter about the political underpinnings of the AfCFTA. I think this is critical because it really speaks to the heart of the objective of the CFTA as one trying to promote an African voice, both politically and economically, trying to strengthen intra-Africa trade, but also to transform the economies of African countries. So in this context, it's not so much about increasing the volume. Increasing the volume of trade is important, but transforming or changing the composition of the products that African countries export, and also moving them from the bottom of the global value chain to further up that value chain, because it's really about the value of what you produce. We've seen African countries in times of commodity price booms, the economies have gone up, improved. There's been a lot of talk about Africa rising, but the sustainability of that growth trajectory has not been what is required, and therefore we've gone through these boom and bust cycles. And of course, the COVID pandemic has laden economies. So the EPA, the African Free Trade Agreement, should, as an indicator of success, not only increase trade, but change the composition of move Africa up the value chain in terms of the kinds of commodities it produces. So then the question is, to what extent do EPAs really foster that objective or not? I mean, I think there are a number of assumptions that would have to be put in place you have to make to determine what would be the outcome. But the fact that you have several different EPAs that may not themselves be harmonized across the different agreements, sub-regional agreements, and the extent to which those EPAs also are aligned with the overall objectives of the AfCFTA is something that we need to understand, because it will then determine the extent to which you have trade diversion or that you actually achieve an objective of intra-Africa trade. Now, the fact is that most African countries do not produce the manufactured goods. And so obviously there's going to be a tendency for more trade with the outside parties in the area of manufactured goods than within. So the incentive for intra-Africa trade in those kinds of manufactured goods to leverage that and to make that increase is something that would have to be examined to see whether these trading arrangements do not reinforce existing patterns of production, but change that. It is not clear to me how that is going to happen. The previous speaker talked about sourcing. First of all, the assumption was that you'd have foreign direct investments whereby, say, European producers would produce in Africa, which would be the ideal situation. But is that an assumption, or is that, what are the drivers of that? I mean, that is not clear to me, because it depends on the nature of the agreements and how those incentives either move production to the continent or keep them away, because you still have the ability to trade without necessarily setting foot in Africa. It's also a function of the perceived risks on the continent and the level of trade facilitation that has already happened. Those are the factors that would draw countries in. And so it's also about sequencing. At what point is that going to happen? If you can still trade with Africa without being in the continent, why would you want to come in there? So what are the incentives and disincentives to actually leverage FDI into the continent? It is not clear to me, because it requires an understanding of what these different EPAs agreed to and how they really reinforce different behavioral patterns. But that said, there are potential benefits in the form of technology transfer, sharing of intellectual property rights. With COVID, we have in Africa the challenge of the production of vaccines on the continent. To what extent, for me, what would be a pivotal and a strategic, mutually, hopefully beneficial arrangement would be that some of these agreements actually create the environment for some of these barriers to local production of key ingredients like vaccines and other intellectual property intensive elements to be to lead to production of those kinds of activities or commodities in Africa. So definitely, in theory, this is EPAs could reinforce the AfCFTA, but the devil is really in the details. And we have to understand. So I would basically then say, well, why don't we pick a few key areas and ask the question, to what extent would these EPAs facilitate, say, the production of vaccines in Africa? To what extent, what are the elements that would either impede or promote those kinds of developments? And then there's the issue of sequencing, but this time sequencing in terms of the agreements that are made, say, in the area of intellectual property rights and investments. Currently, the AfCFTA is in phase 1. Now, to what extent do those agreements that are made in the APA supersede, and how would they be harmonized ex post with what is agreed in the AfCFTA? So there are a number of moving parts here that would have to be really dealt with to be able to make a definitive statement as to what the net benefits would be. How would these agreements address issues such as biopiracy? Basically ensuring that any kind of patent applications that involve biological resources are accompanied by disclosure of the countries of origin and informed consent and all those factors. So my view of the situation is that we need to be able to get to a more granular level in terms of understanding the different moving parts, because you have the AfCFTA as its own set of moving parts, and then you have these EPAs, another set of moving parts, and harmonizing and understanding how they interact really is something that requires more detailed and focused analysis to be able to make a definitive decision as to how it will play out at the country level. And understandably, there have been studies done, but I believe that we need more micro-level studies to be able to move forward. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Syed, over to you.
Are you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay. I'm trying to make sure for my presentation for everyone to share me.
Yes, we can see it clearly.
This is okay? Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased to be with you today. Thank you, Dr. Rosmina, for your efficient management and moderating for this very important session. I would like to thank my colleagues for their comprehensive coverage of the impact of IPA on trade. Today, I'm going to deliver. Okay, Rosmina, are you okay? Hello?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
I'm here.
Okay, I would like to thank Unica for providing me this opportunity to chair this galaxy of experts discussing very important issues that is very timely organized. As we all are aware, the African Continental Free Trade Area is a game changer for the trade in Africa, and there is a great potential and hopes are bent on using this mechanism as a tool to transform the African economies for the future in order to meet the aspirations of the African continent by 2063 and the United Nations agenda by 2030. As a matter of fact, the European Union and the EBA has played an important role in African continent. Let us go back to see the history of the relationship between Africa and Europe. As we all are aware, the Organization of African Unity has started its rule in 1963. At the same year, there was the Yaoundé Agreement between Africa and Europe. This means Europe is there from the early stage of the liberalization in Africa, whether in politician and economic perspectives. Yaoundé is the starting point for the partnership between Africa and Europe, and after that came Lomé 1 and Lomé 2 and Cotonou, and currently the Africa-Europe Alliance for Partnership. Today, I'm going to look for answer for a certain question, which is, our EBA has a positive role to play in the successful implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area. Let's see clearly the answer is yes. The economic partnership agreement plays an important role in Africa and accordingly will enable the African Continental Free Trade Area to achieve its affirmed goals. As you are aware, the African Continental Free Trade Area has a main objective, which is starting by creating a single African market and the socio-economic transformation and the liberalization of goods, services, and capitals and movement of persons. This is the overall goals of the agreement. At the end of the day, with one object, which is to achieve the dream of Africa we want. The key question now is how the African Continental Free Trade Area be successful in meeting its objectives. In this regard, we see that the partnership from the other active parties, such as the European Union, are greatly welcomed. The history of the European Union with Africa is very positive. The European Union is the main trade partner with Africa. It is the main investor and the aid donor for the continent. Therefore, we have to build on this history, and we have a great potential to increase this volume of investment, trade, and aid for future. In particular, colleagues, as you are aware, the African continent has a main feature in trade, which is the supply side constraints. To overcome these supply side constraints, we have to mobilize resources. The African countries don't have the sufficient resources needed for such supply side. Therefore, there is a rare need to ask main partners such as the European Union to lend a hand for African countries to be ready for industrialization, maximize the value addition, and the transform from the economies that basically based on commodities to economies that manufacture and diversify their exportation. Some people need to we need to shed light on how the EBA's active an important role in African countries in general to allow them to be well prepared for efficiently meet the obligations set out by the African Continental Free Trade Area. As we are aware, the agreement has set the stage for the new period in the economic integration in the continent. The EBAs are very important player to successful implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area. In what way? As we are aware that the economic partnership agreements are trade agreements that go beyond the conventional free trade agreements by focusing on development and the socio-economic circumstances through cooperation and assistance. This means the economic partnership agreement is not only focus on trade, but they are going beyond that through the technical assistance and providing the investments which are fully needed for the African countries to prepare themselves for the coming period. Furthermore, the EBAs provide the countries with certain advantages, including the longer-term liberalization periods, flexible rules of origin, special safeguard and measures for agriculture, food security, and infant industry protection. Most importantly, economic partnership agreements act as drivers for change as they kickstart the reform and strengthen good economic governance. All these advantages provided by the EBAs are very needed for all countries in Africa to be prepared for getting the benefit from the advantage provided by the African Continental Free Trade Area. As a matter of fact, we try also to answer a very important question, which is to what extent and how the African Continental, how EU and EBA's implication for successful implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area. Frankly speaking, the EBAs and the EU as a key partner for Africa can provide many features for successful implementation of the African Continental Free Area, including helping the building the institutional capacity of African countries, reducing the cost of logistics. As we are aware, Africa is suffering the weak infrastructure and need huge investments to cover this shortcomings, improving trade-related infrastructure, streamlining non-tariff measures, improving the investment and the business climate, building productive capacities and regional value chain, advancing training and education for skilled workforce. These are the ways and mechanisms through which the EU and the EBAs can help African countries, and accordingly the African Continental Free Trade Area to achieve the aspired objectives. Furthermore, the European Union and EBAs can cooperate and encompass the financial assistance for the African Continental Free Trade Area. The EU can align the European investment initiatives in Africa with the AfCFTA approach in order to secure the economic opportunities it offers. Africa-EU cooperation on trade and regional integration should focus on private sector, which is the key player in development in Africa, and also focus on trade integration, which is an essential factor to increase trade flow on both sides. As a matter of fact, when we evaluate the impact of the EU and EBAs on the implementation of the SAFTA successful implementation, we should be aware that the successful implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area as well plays an important role for the European side. First of all, it will enhance the trade between Africa and Europe. Second is the implementation of African Continental Free Trade Area will create job opportunities for the African users and accordingly limit the illegal migration to Europe. Furthermore, the African Continental Free Trade Area creates a space for the EU to move beyond the traditional development cooperation and help Africa to overcome the interconnected challenges of supply side and market access constraints. Most importantly, the African Continental Free Trade Area will work as a facilitator for investments in value-adding and labor-intensive sectors that require expanded markets for goods and services in Africa and have potential to access the African to the European markets. The AfCFTA will secure the advancement of the economic integration process and the coherent economic strategy as essential component at continental levels in Africa to boost trade relations with the EU, and it will set the ground for a continent-to-continent cooperation. As a matter of fact, we should be aware that during this period and the early stage of implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area, we need a dire support from the donor countries, in particular the European Union, with its capacity as the main provider for investment aid donor and the strategic trade partners with Africa. These efforts will enable the African economies to perform well and will enable the African Continental Free Trade Area to organize the economic activities in the continent in the way that lead at the end of the day to meet the aspirations of the continent Africa we need by 2063. Rose, hello? Hello? Ahmed.
We can hear you, Syed, at least that I can hear you.
Okay. To have the long story short, we are in a successful story of cooperation between the European Union and the African continent. We have to crystallize further this sort of cooperation in the way that serve both sides. Now the opportunity is more wider and more open for both sides. Africa and Europe are close to each other and have common history, and the closeness of two sides and the common history will strongly cement the successful implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area. And through the respective organizations such as the UNICA and all the institutions involved in this event, we jointly have a great role to play, because the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat alone will not do everything. The civil society and the experts from different perspectives are invited to help these organizations to maximize the benefit from the resources available in Africa and the techniques and the investments available in Europe in order to maximize the potential of this strategic partnership between the continents in future. Thank you very much, and I welcome any questions. Hello?
Sorry, I was on mute. Thank you, Syed. I was just asking if the organizers and Mr. Adiemi, if you, I see we're going to run over time, but if you'll just grant us an additional 10 minutes so that we may hear from our discussant, Professor Ogenkola, and then make some summary remarks after that. Is that okay, Mr. Adiemi? Okay, I will take silence as yes. So over to our final discussant, Professor Ogenkola, over to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I would just like to share a slide. So I wish Syed can leave the space so that I can do it.
Yes.
Syed.
Yes, yes, yes. I'm doing now. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, and I thank the organizer for organizing this and for inviting me. And the disadvantage and advantage of the last speaker, I will maximize or optimize so that it will not sound like a boring story to all of us. All the previous speakers have actually covered most of the important issues here, but mine is to highlight one or two issues, and then from there we can then move on to the next stage. Just a minute. Can you say this? Hello? Is anybody with me?
Yes, yes.
We can.
Okay.
Yes, we can see it.
This will be the framework for my intervention. But let me start by saying, when you look at the African EU trade regimes, you will discover that we have close to 5 or 6 of them. FTAs with the North African countries, some EPAs, then we have 3 preferential trade agreements, EU's generalized system of preferences, the GSP Plus, and the EBA. And we have African Continental Free Trade Area trying to integrate all the countries involved in this. Again, we need to think seriously. Is EPA actually promoting regional integration or hindering the regional integration agreement? We need to be clear about this. I've had Bartholomew, I've had the first presenter, but we just need to do a thorough analysis how these different regimes, different relations is affecting the goal of AfCFTA and the goal of establishing African Economic Community. Point number 2, we more or less answer the question, what are the challenges to a successful implementation of AfCFTA? Of course, I agree with the previous presenters that the AfCFTA is beyond trade liberalization. And by the way, even EPA is beyond trade. There are aspects that concerns development and socioeconomic issues and cooperation. So if we look at the 2 documents, EPA representing the trade regimes with Africa, and we also look at AfCFTA. The original intention was not just to embark on CFTA alone, Continental Free Trade Area, but to also combine it with boosting intra-African trade, that's the BIT. And we have 7 pillars. And almost all the presenters have mentioned all these issues. So I think these are the challenges to successful implementation of AfCFTA. When you look at the issue of lack of productive capacity, the argument here is very simple. If you reduce tariffs among yourself, even to 0, do you have the capacity to actually trade among yourselves? Again, people have talked about regional value chains, and with 0 tariffs among African countries, what are the challenges to having regional value chains? There are many of them. There are issues of non-tariff barriers, which we still need to address. There are issues of free movement of factors of production across countries in Africa. Next is also the issue, I'm just not following this. There are issues about insufficient physical infrastructure, which is number 4 here. If you look at that also, what are the issues or what are the symptoms of this? High cost of doing business. And to what extent can e-commerce, digitalization of the economy, appropriate energy services, transportation be addressed? Because without addressing this, it is doubtful if AfCFTA will be successfully implemented. We need to think about the adjustment cost. And at this level, it is not at public sector or government level. The private sector, there we need to adjust. Firms also we need to adjust. Government we need to adjust. Labor especially. How are we going to address all this? So the point I'm raising is that these are some of the challenges that will require reform, further reform, and strengthening instruments before AfCFTA can be successful. What are the approach? I just mentioned 1 or 2 of them. First, there is no doubt that EU, either through the trade arm or generally in terms of a fund in different directions, has been helping Africa. But there is need for a change to make AfCFTA the central pillar of the support. What do I mean by this? Is whoever is requesting for support, it should be linked to what we make AfCFTA successful. For example, if some countries are asking for training and retraining of their workforce, we should be able to link that one to the impact on AfCFTA. That's what I mean by central pillar of further support. The second point that I'm going to make relates to the approach. I will suggest that there is need for coherence and coordinated EU support to the AfCFTA. Whether this is feasible given the different trade regimes that we have is a big question. But more importantly, what I have in mind by saying coherence and coordinated is a scheme where both at EU country level and at EU Commission, there is need for handshake, proper handshake, in terms of which countries are they supporting in Africa or which region. But more importantly, in terms of the pillars that I have here. In other words, the trade policy, trade facilitation, productive capacity, trade-related infrastructure, and so on and so forth. This is more so given that e-commerce is now becoming the order of the day. there is need to also incorporate digitalization of the economy to do this. And I believe that given BIAT as well as EPA, the component that relates to development and socioeconomic circumstances, this will go a long way in making AfCFTA a successful program. I thank you all.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you for providing the ellipsis, the ... rather than a full stop on all of our presentations today. Now, I think we have time for a few questions, and then it will be my prerogative to wrap up this session. The first question, I think it's specifically for San. San, are there plans to enforce rules of origin legislation given the weak customs and border controls in most, as they say, African countries?
Yes, thank you. I've seen this question. I mean, it is, the question could be interpreted two ways. I mean, there is first the rules of origin from the African CFTA. That's for the, that's for Africa to you know, and African countries to enforce these rules of origin. And then indeed you could have, I mean, it is possible to conceive different interpretations or strictness in the way they are applied. For the EU, it is quite simple. I mean, the EU has, you know, as a regime that is very strict. So there is a clear documentation of what has to be provided. And if, you know, and there are controls, if this is not met, you know, the products are not accepted as recognized as originating from one country and therefore cannot benefit from the preferences. So, I mean, the problem is not on the EU side, the problem is on the African side, and there are some, there is some rules and, some support that is provided custom for custom procedures and custom facilitation that is provided also by the EU. If you allow me perhaps just to address a couple of just points that were made also during the very interesting presentation. Professor Ogenkola was talking about the need for coherent and coordinated support. There, I mean, and probably along the BIAT, I would agree totally with that. But I would say that there is really a very strong role for Africa to play, because there's a need not just for Europe to provide coordinated supports, but coherent support, but in fact for all external supports. And in that respect, I think that the setup of the African the African CFTA Secretariat is a very good endeavor, and there's also you know, working with the African Union. I think there is a, you know, the merit of trying to foster greater coordination or mechanisms for coordinations at the African level to try to coordinate donors, knowing that, I mean, it is a nightmare to try to coordinate donors. They all have their own rules and so on. So we know Europe is trying to make an effort, but this is difficult. But I think Africa could do more. Just very, I think Bartholomew was mentioning several very relevant points and asking a lot of questions. He was talking about the lack of diversifications. I think, which is really, you know, and Africa exporting too many raw commodities and not enough higher value added products. I think this is really the endeavor. And what we were trying to say, I think, you know, many of us, all of us during our speeches, this is the endeavor. And we heard very clearly from Christina as well, that's, you know, that's also what the EU is trying to push for. But there, I would say that there are just some lessons. That trade preferences in themselves, and we have seen that for decades with the preferences that the EU has provided, are not sufficient to stimulate diversification. So trade policy alone is perhaps, or at least a tariff reduction is not enough. And there are 2 points. Is first, that a lot of the bottlenecks now and the restrictions to trade are not in the form of tariffs and quotas. They are in the forms of standards, regulatory standards. So either formal regulatory standards imposed by governments, and Europe is not going to lower its standards to please some some less developed countries. So these are the same for everybody, but also there are a lot of private standards that are coming up. And I think the challenge, if you want to access the European market, but increasingly the international market, and it's also there's a demand by consumers in Africa and by the rising middle class to have much also higher standards in Africa. So I think it's the question of how do you meet these standards, and there's a lot of this work that that can be done. And in that sense, economic partnership agreements and African CFTA provisions can help. Benedict was mentioning that, but that needs to be accompanied also by support. The second element is really about the investment for the production capacity. And there, I think there's, and try to stimulate investment to do so. So Europe, there I would see it's not just in the context of Ipas. If Ipas were to disappear tomorrow, you would not have diversification. It would not lead to a diversification of production in Africa. So the question is not just about do we like Ipas or not, but how do we make them useful, or what more is required? And Europe has a very ambitious agenda to try to combine the investment support with the aid and technical assistance, and with the regulatory environments. They call that the External Investment Plan, and now under their new budgets, the European Fund for Sustainable Development, and the new approach that they are trying to promote, which is very promising, and has been discussed also in the context of the EU-Africa partnership. But the question is, I think Africa should try to do something similar, not instead of simply responding to what Europe is proposing. There should be such kind of endeavor where you bring the different development finance institutions and public development banks at the regional and national and sub-national level in Africa, coming together. They're very well organized in Europe, far less in Africa. And I think that would be, there are issues discussed in summits, like there was the first summit of public development bank finance in common. I would really like to see Africa public finance institutions coming together to think, how can we have a big plan around the African CFTA, boosting productivity, and then engaging with the partners. And we heard it echoing also what we heard about China yesterday and so on. So it's not just the EU, but the EU is really trying to organize itself much better to try to do that. And we could see the same from the African side. And, we discussed about elements, for instance, of, the importance, how do you stimulate trade? So thinking about alliance of trade promotion agencies and investment promotion agencies at the Pan-African level. How could they work better together? This is, also around the investment facilitation and trade facilitation that is important. So could there be some initiatives like that in Africa? And having talked to some stakeholders in Europe, there are some trade promotion agencies or investment promotions in Europe that would be interested to be able to link up more with what is done at the African side. So there are some very concrete possible ideas of how we could create some kind of joint platforms, and in my view would be much better if, instead of being purely even bilateral Europe-Africa, if there were really more mechanisms that were developed, like the NAPAD EU Development Agency that has been put in place, that would be the anchor points for support of donors coming in from from America, from Asia, from Europe, from different parts. So that would be a way to have this coherence and support.
Excellent contributions there, San. I think I'm going to call on now Mr. Mensa. He's been waiting patiently to offer his intervention. Joseph, over to you. You may be on mute. Okay. Well, then how about Mr. Adjemi? You have your hand up.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Rosmina. I wanted to offer the following as, let me preface that by saying that my full-time job at ACA is to go, across Africa countries, engage ministers, engage high-level policy officials on the challenges of CFTA. And some of the things that I've heard today, speak to some of the challenges, but they also make certain very critical points. You see, African countries that I engage with, and I there are so many. They are not oblivious of the fact that Ipas and other such agreements can be beneficial and are also beneficial to their countries on the bilateral level. This is not where the argument is. The argument is as follows, and I'm very happy that Professor Ogenkola summarized it very, very well. The argument is as follows: if we were to have, say technically, we were to have 45 such agreements, say with 45 African countries, would that at an operational level negatively impact the implementation of CFTA? That's what the first fundamental thing. Therefore, secondly, the question we get asked is, instead of all of these things, these bilateral arrangements, even if not agreement, some kind of arrangement, is it better to have such arrangement with the CFTA Secretariat in Accra, Ghana, for example, so that all of the challenges of coordination, harmonization that Ogenkola spoke about can be just integrated at the secretarial level? Because what happens now is that the agreement with the particular country may be based on certain things, and which is fine. Countries have told us we have a right to do, we are sovereign countries, we have a right to do agreement based on our national interest, and this is good. So we have an ecosystem of colliding national interests all over the place, and then this has to have some kind of impact on the CFTA implementation, even if they are good if they are good for those countries that did it. So the whole idea then is not about the question. The real fundamental question is not whether these bilateral trade agreements are good, because they are good for those countries. It is to look at their impact on the higher agenda of regional integration, or whether if we were to have this kind of agreement between Turkey and 45 countries in Africa, between EU and 54 countries in Africa, between India and 72 countries, all of this stuff, what do we have in terms of implementation of CFTA? How does it impact the whole agenda of investment, of intellectual property, of competition, of digital trade? How do we bring this together? And the reason I'm seeking help is, again, as I said, this is exactly what I do at ACA, is to confront the challenges and seek answers to them. I'm happy that San and the other excellent colleagues are here to offer some help. So that is really where I come in, and I just want to thank you, Rosmina. Joata Asamensa has been waiting. I hope that it can still come in. I think it was muted earlier on. I thank you, Rosmina.
Thank you. I think I think he has an issue intervening because he doesn't have permission to enter the conversation. So is it possible for the IT group to allow him permission to intervene?
Okay, well, I will take care of that right away. Thank you.
Thank you. In the meantime, anyone else in our audience, do you have any questions, comments, cries of anguish? All right, then while we're waiting, oh, Christina.
Yeah.
Hello, I think I have the permission now, if I may.
Oh, okay. Christina, if you'll just allow us, because Mr. Atamensa would like to make his intervention, and then I will give you the floor.
Excellent.
All right, over to you, Joseph.
Thank you so much. Thanks to the organizers for allowing me to come in. I think there are two issues here that we need to separate. And the question of the CFTA and the question of the EPAs. I think these are two separate things. And I know that the hearts of the European Union is at the right place, but I think the way the EPAs were structured was not helping or would not help our integration agenda. Because you have the negotiations which were done in terms of different groups, subgroups. You have like East and Southern Africa as a group, West Africa as a group, and then you have Southern as a group. And all these things does not augur well for the way the integration agenda should be. And I think that, you know, the question now that we have a CFTA, which is part of the integration agenda of the African Union, maybe the EU probably would want to reconsider the framework of the EPAs, and perhaps maybe put one EPA on the table between Africa. And when I say Africa, I mean total Africa. It's not separated by sub-Saharan Africa or whatever. I think we talk about Africa as Africa, the 54 countries making up Africa, or 55 countries by the definition of AU, and have one framework in which we are going to negotiate. And one good thing that could come out from that arrangement, as I see it, it could present a position where Africa can, you know, begin moving towards the CFTA. Take, for instance, if the EU is successful in negotiating with Africa to say that trade will come in under a common tariff, Africa and the EU has a customs union, right? So if generally, I mean, like I said, their hearts are the right place, and I appreciate the support they give to ECA, the support they want to give to the CFTA Secretariat. But I think this is where we need to go, and therefore I also call on African countries should not feel like, you know, they cannot do without other partners. They should be strong enough not to, you know, whittle down the CFTA agreement by engaging in bilateral agreements like what Ghana has done, like what Cote d'Ivoire has done, what Kenya is intending to do with the US. All these tends to weaken the CFTA. And the last point I want to make on the CFTA itself is that, whilst I think it's a separate issue, is Africa should, you know, all those who have not ratified should ratify. As Professor Wale said, we should build the infrastructure, the facilities that are needed to enhance trade, because the CFTA is about Africa trading with itself. I think partners should understand that the trading within Africa is very low. And what we want to do is to increase trade within Africa itself, and support that comes in should be with that focus in mind. Because once you come in and say you want to use the EPAs, I heard the Sal from this morning, you know, the discussions and all that, given the impression that the EPAs might enhance trade. I see that the EPAs could derail that trade. I think we should be careful here. So if EU wants to, we have one common framework and we negotiate that. I thank you. I'm sorry that I've been too long. I thank you very much. And I thank the organizers for giving me the permission to come in.
No, thank you very much, Joseph, for giving us and reminding us of that different perspective. I think, as you recall, during the negotiations of the AfCFTA, as well as looking forward to Agenda 2063, African countries were determined and are still determined to speak with one voice, right? So one voice representing Africa. So thank you for reminding us that there is no clear answer, there's no clear path forward in terms of reconciling the EPAs with the objectives. Remember, this all comes back to the objectives of and the intent of implementing an AfCFTA for the continent. And there's no clear answer because African countries all display different patterns, different stages and levels of different evolution in this respect. Christina, I think you wanted to also make an intervention, so the floor is now yours.
Thanks a lot, Rosmita. Yes, I would like to reply to some of the questions and comments that have been made, particularly by Bartolomeu, Professor Alwale, Adeyemi, and Joseph. I want to make 4 points. One on the synergies between Ipas and the African Continental FTA, one on rules of origin, one on the Europe-Africa Alliance, and one on the continent-to-continent FTA that Joseph just made reference to. So starting on the synergies, I just want to make again the point that it is historical, it's factual that the Ipas experience has helped African countries to negotiate the African Continental FTA in record time, also not yet finished, and it may help implement the African Continental FTA effectively. One of the particularities of Ipas is that unlike other new FTAs, it predates the African Continental FTA. So, and the African Continental FTA distinguishes between the new and the existing agreements with third countries. So in that sense, IPA are grandfathered by the Continental FTA. And the Continental FTA, finally, as Sam was underlined, it is not against external trade agreements. It is an FTA, not a customs union, and it is compatible with other FTAs. So IPAs and African Continental FTA are fully compatible, and most of it's even complementary. And again, as we were underlined, the IPAs can be instrumental, can be those kind of existing building structures in which you could rely on to build up the African Continental FTA. I think it is a very good idea, the one that Sam and also Adeyemi have made reference to the role that the African Union Commission or the Secretariat General in Accra could have to coordinate the sharing of experiences of what lessons have been learned with the implementation of existing agreements, what lessons we can learn, and how we can make sure that there is a further coherence and harmonization. So I think that is an interesting idea to explore. Just underline that there is no contradiction at all between the African Continental FTA and the IPAs. It is a false contradiction. On the contrary, as I say, they are complementary. And on rules of origin, I want to make a clarification because Sam replied to some of the remarks, but I wanted to make reference to the particular situation of IPAs on rules of origin. So IPAs provide very flexible rules of origin and far-reaching possibilities to accumulate origin, allowing for significant amount of sourcing of inputs, raw material, and intermediary goods among African parties that can still qualify for tariff-free entry into the European Union. So it is a good starting point, but the point I wanted to underline is that under the communication I referred to, the trade policy review communication, the European Commission is proposing the idea to explore additional ways to facilitate the integration in the African continent through more harmonized rules of origin applicable to our trade with Africa. So some participants were interested in this avenue to be explored. I just want to confirm that this is one of the areas that we will be looking at in the context of our TPR communication. Joseph, on the question of the continent-to-continent objective, this is for us a long-term perspective. I fully agree with you that it could be the ideal situation, but this is a long-term vision. In the short term, first of all, there is, first of all, the African Continental FTA needs to be implemented. Secondly, there is no evidence to claim that African countries need or want to harmonize their tariff on their imports from Europe. Currently, the IPAs have very different market schedule liberalizations. So it would not be so easy to have one single market schedule to the European Union. Politically, it might not be so evident to be in a position now to have such a common proposal for the EU. But we strongly believe that in the long term, and certainly once that the African Continental Customs Union takes place, is on place, we can certainly negotiate a continent-to-continent FTA. This is the idea that ex-President Juncker raised at the Europe-Africa Alliance in 2018, and it has been undertaken by the communication, the trade policy review communication that I was referring to. I would like to reassure Joseph and other speakers that have asked about our support to the African Continental FTA, just insist that this is very close to European Union's heart. And as my ambassador was saying yesterday, just to share this information with you, which is very relevant, I just want to inform you that in the future, the European Union will continue to be a strong supporter of the African Continental FTA, politically, technically, and financially. And the news is that this area of cooperation might become one of the main pillars of our multi-annual program for the next 7 years. And with this, I just want to make a clarification. With this, I finalize. Some participants in the chat were making reference to the Africa-Europe Alliance and to the new platform that has been set up by Friends of Europe. I just want to clarify that this platform, the strategic group that has been set up by Friends of Europe, does not replace the alliance. The alliance is still the institutional and the strategic framework between Africa and Europe. It will now become a joint strategy. And the initiative by Friends of Europe is a complementary one, a very significant one, because the intention is to bring into this partnership a broad number of stakeholders to engage into the dialogue and to see how they can contribute to this common agenda, particularly focusing on the private sector and on the civil society. So it does not replace the alliance, it complements the partnership between Europe and Africa. Thanks a lot. I'm sorry for being so long, but I thought there were pieces of information that would be useful for participants. Thank you.
Not at all, not at all. I think it was very interesting and really, like I said, this is a forum, this is a place where we want to bring all of these realistic perspectives and ideas to the table. I think we could go on and on and on, but you know, as moderator, I have to bring a close to the session at some point today. But I see there's one last hand up, and I will give you the opportunity, Professor Molaku Desta, to say something. I think you had your hand up. If not, then I will bring the session to a close. Prof, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Rosmina. Appreciate it. I was not able to listen to a lot of the conversation because of power issues here where I am in Addis. But I just wanted to intervene on some of the issues that were made toward the end of this discussion so far. I think it is really self-evident that economic partnership agreements, as currently structured, and this is a qualification that we need to make, as currently structured, I think they are detrimental to the CFTA project. In fact, the reality is they have already caused a lot of damage at the regional economic community level in Africa, making it hard for countries to stay on course with their integration programs within sub-regions, making it difficult in a way to stay on course, in regional arrangements between neighboring countries. I don't think I need to name names here. So I think it is very obvious, let alone when we are talking about Africa, the CFTA, Africa, the continent, where the AfCFTA is clearly aiming to produce a continental single market, overcoming the existing divide between North and South, and even overcoming or going beyond, not necessarily overcome, going beyond the regional economic communities that we have today. So I don't think there is any question about that. But remember, when we say they are detrimental to the regional integration project, we are not, nobody to my knowledge has argued that the individual African countries negotiating bilateral arrangements are breaching their legal obligations under the CFTA agreement. They are not. The CFTA agreement does not prohibit these countries from entering into these arrangements. But the question we should ask is, why is that? That is because the CFTA agreement itself was negotiated in the shadow of the realities we are talking about. So it had to accommodate the existing challenges, the realities that we have. So if we're talking about Ipas, or we're talking about Ipas because it so happened to be the agenda for the day, but all other bilateral arrangements between countries or groups of countries within Africa versus non-African countries. I think this has to be clear. And when it comes to the EPS, the European Union, the one issue that I always have is, it's about coherence between one arm of the European Union and another arm of the European Union. Look at the development aid, the development assistance that the European Union provides to Africa at national, regional, continental levels. Then we are.
We're losing you, Prof. You're breaking up a bit. Yeah, I think he's having connectivity issues. So what we'll do is, Prof, I think we got the gist. And of course, as always, we can always rely on you.
Detrimental impact is another. Let me stop here, Rodina. Thank you so much.
No, not at all. I think we appreciate the connectivity issues where you are, but just to say that we can always rely on you for offering us a new challenge. And like I said, providing an ellipsis, a ... rather than a full stop on this session. Just to capture a couple of points for our organizers, because all I can say is, wow, this has been a great session. And I think our organizers are going to be very happy because a number of concrete policy options have come out of this room today. And all to say what that means, to me at least, is we brought the right people to the table. So a couple of points just to summarize on. I hope we all draw inspiration from the building blocks of existing African structures in various areas of the continent. And we tap into these existing structures, as Christina emphasized as well. Benedict, I think it was really key to have you at the table. I think what is always missing from the conversation is the stakeholder contribution to the AfCFTA's successful implementation. It will be key to the successful implementation of any agreement, not just the AfCFTA, but other arrangements, as Professor Desta alluded to. So remember, the business community, engage them and keep all of your stakeholders in the loop as we proceed and approach implementation. You will realize, in effect, as we know in trade, that business actually creates the enabling environment in which we, as the AfCFTA sort of operators, work within. Sequencing, I don't think I have to remind people there were stirs of echo in the room about sequencing that doesn't need to be re-emphasized. The roadmap that I alluded to in my remarks, I think, is key and should be under serious consideration, but it has to be purposive, it has to be intentional, and it has to be forward-looking. And I think there were some interventions made where it should also be strategic. It should also be strategic and pivotal, which means you need to know where you want to land. Where do we want to arrive at with implementation, successful implementation? What does that mean? What is the definition of that? And finally, I think I will pause there, and I would like to thank all of our panelists, including our principal presenter, San, who set the tone for this very, very fruitful discussion. And now I think I will return the microphone to Mr. Adeyemi. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Rosemina. And thanks to San, thanks to Christina. I got some, of course, Benedict, I got some private mails, people saying, oh, you brought so many experts on EU, on EPAs and all that. And I've just said to them, well, look, maybe you missed the last 2 days. Experts have come on India, Turkey, Brazil, and so on and so forth. So for me, Rosemina, I think we can sing and dance at the same time. I as one of the implementers of the support of European Union to Africa and to ECA, I will not turn my back away from that, but I reserve the right to point to our colleagues in the European Union, evidence from the field where I operate from, evidence from the field to say these are the challenges, this is where we are, this is what we can do about it. So just to say before we go to the next thing is that the main thing we are hearing is that how will external agreements with third parties impact the implementation of CFTA? That is the central question in terms of the rules of origin, in terms of the elimination of the possibility of using CFTA to smuggle arms. You know that is happening, and then the consequences of bifurcation, as I have spoken about. Now, lastly, I think that Ogenkola mentioned something. I'm sorry, Rosmina, that I'm abusing the privilege that I took over. I was the focal point for NEPAD for over 10 years. And one of the things that the African Union did that worked very well was to say whoever was going to support Africa, anybody who was going to support Africa, EU, Canada, anybody, you have to go through the entry point is the NEPAD. So, which was why I was very happy when Ogenkola was saying, will the European Union consider making a CFTA implementation the central pillar of its support, so that we say, okay, in order to start at least the process of coherence and coordination, okay, we are fully in support of implementation of CFTA. We are actually supporting it. So if you are going to come in as a private sector from Europe, go through, let us have the prism of CFTA. Lastly, I promise that one of the things that we will do after this, as part of the exercise and follow-up, is to start documenting, and I think Christina has hinted on that, to start documenting empirical evidence of of the benefits of this kind of arrangement, so that we now emerge from just pontification, and we can say, look, EPA helped here in this regard, and it is not. It is also in alignment with the spirit and operation of CFTA. We are going to be contacting all of our excellent presenters to please consider developing this presentation, upgrading them into publishable articles, so that the partners can then find a way to bundle all of this together and use them for the needed knowledge that is necessary as we move forward. Let me thank you again, Rosmina, and then go to the next panel, the next session, which is going to be moderated by our Dr. Samuel Lorentoba. It is on trade linkages and implications for CFTA, looking at Russia and Brazil. Moderator is Samuel Lorentoba, again, from our partner institution, Carleton University. Professor Lorentoba, please take it over.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed the last session. It was great to see San again after many years, and our Professor Ogenkola, Rostamina, and all that. So this session is on the trade linkages and implication after implementation with Russia and Brazil. I'm by no means an expert on any of this, but I've been asked to moderate the session, and we'll be having Professor Jide Ofo Adibe. I'm not sure if he's here. Joao Palos Alves from Brazil as two presenters, and then we'll have discussant. I think we'll have just the discussant, because I can be moderating and discussing, but Charles Ojubana and Andrea Adams, and Dr. Tilahu will not be coming. I think he has some clash of programs from African Development Bank. But just to start by saying that Africa is like a beautiful bride, as it were, at this time. And that's why we see a lot of interest from everywhere. Suitors, I would say, that want to see who will offer the best deal, and then to get the bride away. And in that context, we've seen over the past 2 days, we've seen from the US perspective, India, Turkey, and now we're looking at Russia and Brazil. And I'd like to start by saying that Russia re-engagement with Africa after the decolonization period is a kind of consideration for geopolitics in the context of competition with the US, the European Union, and China in particular. And Moscow is looking for both allies and of course, opportunity to boost growth. You will realize that Russia has been under a lot of sanctions from the EU for its involvement in Ukraine and Crimea. And then, well, of course, over the past few years, trade has increased between Russia and Africa. Export to sub-Saharan Africa actually total about $3 billion in 2018. And import from Africa is about 1.7 billion. And from 2005 to 2015, trade has increased about 185%, citing one of the speakers today at debate. And of course, like many other countries, external partners, the trade relations have been concentrated in Egypt, Morocco, Guinea, Cote d'Ivoire, and South Africa. These countries accounted for about 80% of Africa exports to Russia. The intervention of Russia in Africa, the engagement with Africa is also limited to gas, oil and gas, the mining sector with companies like Gazprom, Lukoil, Rostec, and Rosatom, and they are active in Africa. And some of these companies have actually signed agreement with as many as 18 African countries. And then Russia is also planning to build an African Center of Excellence and nuclear power in Ethiopia. And Russia is so much engaged in the arms deal. They are actually the largest supplier of arms to Africa. And of course, they are also engaged in a lot of large mining projects in Zimbabwe, DRC, Congo, and Angola. Some of those trade, they are also in agricultural products like fruit, cocoa, coffee, and potato. And just before I moved to Brazil, I was talking to General Shola Williams yesterday, and we need to thank him for his involvement, his idea, and the coordination on this webinar, that we should look at the aspect of security in the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area, given the fact that Russia is the largest arms supplier to Africa. And we see a lot of non-state actors taking arms and challenging the legitimacy of the state in different parts of Africa, Nigeria, Mozambique, Central African Republic. To what extent can AfCFTA actually succeed without security, without stability? I think that's one of the questions we want our discussant to talk about today. And of course, Brazil have been engaged with Africa, especially from during President Lula. And I mean, this President Roosevelt also followed in that. And this has increased Brazil trade to about 20 billion, I think, as at 2011. Of course, with the new president, the Trump of Latin America, I think that engagements are decreased. So, but we want to see how these countries can help working with Africa to ensure the success of the African Continental Free Area. So with that said, I would like to invite Professor Jide Ofo Adibe, if he's here. Is he here? Okay. If it's not, then let's invite Joe Polo, who is the coordinator of the Brazil Africa Institute in Brazil. You have 20 minutes.
Thank you very much, Dr. Samuel. First of all, I'd like to thank ECA for inviting the Brazil Africa Institute and giving us the space to speak here, and also to congratulate all my fellow co-panelists here. And also thank you all for allowing us to share a little bit about Brazil's perspective on not only the AfCFTA, but also African integration and African opportunities and Brazil-Africa relations in general. May I share my screen here?
So,
okay. Can you see the presentation?
Exactly.
So regarding Brazil-Africa relations in this regard, it is important to notice that Brazil and Africa have always had a close proximity, but this relationship has grown into a brotherhood and a strong solidarity feeling throughout the last couple of years, throughout the last 10 or 20 years. My presentation goes from a brief background and an overview of past Brazil-Africa relations, which grew to a very constructive trade, investment, and political relations in the past 20 years, and to a diagnosis of what is the state of Brazil-Africa relations now, and what are the main issues and the main challenges, but also the main opportunities that we have in this sense. And finally, coming to a way forward, sort of a path that maybe we can try to track together and define the next steps for rebuilding and rethinking Brazil-Africa relations so that they can be more constructive and more sustainable in the long term. It's important to notice that between the year 2000 and 2010, Brazil and Africa benefited from a commodity boom that drove economic growth in both sides and created space for unprecedented trade and investment linkages. This was the most prolific period for Brazil-Africa relations. But this economic relations between Brazil and Africa are very much intertwined with a key concept here, which is coordination. And this coordination is built upon four main pillars. One of them is diplomatic will. The other one is public-private coalitions inside Brazil, but also inside African countries, and a matching between supply and demand on both sides. So you need to have all this in the stage in order to have a sort of a coordination between both sides to understand how prolific and how profitable these economic relations can be to build a sustainable relationship in the long term. And this was pretty much in place between 2000 and 2010. So you had a general coordination, which is somewhat materialized in the creation, for instance, of the South America, Africa summits, which had 3 installments and was sort of a mechanism to bring all these heads of state, all these leaders together so they could build a general understanding of what were the opportunities that South American countries faced, Brazil being the largest South American country and the largest economy here, but also what were the opportunities that Africa as a continental bloc, as a key actor in the 21st century had to offer as well. This was the materialization of a general coordination between the two regions, and that had prolific results, that had many positive outcomes in the short and medium term. You also had as part of this coordination, as one of the pillars, you had a very strong diplomatic and political will to not only regional integration in both regions individually. For instance, in South American side, you had the creation of the Community of South American Nations, UNASUR, in 2008, but you also had the creation of the African Union on the other side. And this was very important to drive inter-regional relations as well. So you had this urge for building regional integration, but you also had this urge to build, and this diplomatic will to build inter-regional relations as well. You had a very strong public-private coalition building inside Brazil that led to the development of public-private linkages between Brazilian companies, Brazilian multinationals such as Petrobras, such as Vale and Embrapa, and their overall drive towards the African markets. But we also had business coalitions in Brazil as a result of this diplomatic will, coordinating better to explore African markets in a way that they never did before. So you had SMEs and large Brazilian companies exporting to African countries to an extent that was never seen before. And you had on both sides a matching between supply and demand. You had this economic growth, this economic boom that led to much more intertwined relations between Brazil and African countries. So between 2000 and 2010, you had Brazilian exports surging in very value-added sectors, and Brazil every time more inserted into international trade. For instance, you have here a comparison between the exports volumes of machines, electronics, vehicles, plastics, and pharmaceuticals. And you can see that they grew exponentially. They grew twice as much, thrice as much between 2000 and 2010. And this was true to a much larger scale, yes, because of the size of the African economy, which is much larger, in African imports as well. The economic growth of African countries follow the same pattern, and African imports were also growing to a never-seen scale. And you had machines, electronics, vehicles, plastics, and pharmaceuticals, for instance, just to name a few of the most value-added or more manufactured-based industries growing at extents that you have never seen before. So you had a convergence between economic growth on both sides that allowed for a unprecedented Brazil-Africa trade. So you had a trend of growth that reached its peak in 2013, but the trend of growth went all the way from 2001 to 2008. You can see here that there is a small decay as a result of the 2008 economic crisis in the world, but you had this overall growth and economic linkages that led to a very prolific and very positive relationship between Brazil and Africa in the economic sectors. But this didn't last long. This lasted until, as I said, 2013, 2014. The diagnosis of the current situation and the state of Brazil-Africa relations over the course of the last decade has been pretty much negative after the end of the Lula's and Dilma Rousseff's presidency. You had in the 2010s and 2020s in this last decade, Brazil struggling with political and economic crisis and an overall retraction of its African foreign policy. And you had consequently a retraction of South Atlantic trade. So the same economic relations, they started to lack coordination between both sides of the South Atlantic, mainly due to the Brazilian side of things. You had the loss of diplomatic will, you had the loss of the public-private coalitions, and you had the loss of the interest on the supply side of things. But you still had Africa growing at the same extent, and Africa booming its economic growth and creating further linkages with other economies, as Brazil was set aside on this very same stage. You had, for instance, a strong coordination between African countries and other extra-regional actors that you didn't quite see anymore in the last decade, as the South American African Summit had its last edition in 2013, for instance. So you had China inserting itself every time more in the African continent. You had India, Russia, and European countries such as UK. And you had all this high-level coordination, this relationship building between leaders that coordinated the necessary the needs, challenges, and opportunities between their regions and Africa as a growing actor in international relations. But you didn't have quite the same impetus from Brazil anymore. You have a diplomatic will in Brazil that is much more focused now towards rebuilding its and reinforcing its Atlantic relations with North America and with European countries. And you can see by mapping the Belt and Road Initiative, for instance, that Brazil, as a solely Atlantic country, suffers with the risk of being left aside in this change of economic access from the transatlantic relations to the trans-Pacific relations and to Pacific and Indo-Pacific economies. And with this overall integration, Brazil suffers with the risk of being set aside, and it has not done much to try to insert itself or show itself as a positive partner to this Belt and Road Initiative or to the integration of African countries, which are very much of interest for Chinese, Russian, and Indian economies to be part of this larger framework for economic integration that that is an alternative for the traditional ties between North Atlantic economies. So you have in Brazil much of a decoupling between the public sector and the private sector, and you have the destruction, so to say, of this public-private coalitions that drove Brazil and Brazilian companies to go explore African markets to the extent that they did before. So you had these companies, not only multinational companies, but also small and medium enterprises in Brazil that are now much more focused on trying to build investment and trade relationships with North American countries and with European countries. And they're not seeking African markets with the same impetus that they were before. So this public-private linkages in Brazil have eroded and have compromised the overall economic relationship between Brazil and Africa. And you can see that since the 2010, since 2011, you have an overall decay of Brazilian exports in these very same sectors, in these very same more value-added sectors, manufactured sectors, that have led the Brazilian economy to become more and more agro-industrial dependent and dependent upon the supply of basic supplies like food and agricultural products to either the United States, Argentina, which is one of our largest partners, the European Union, or China. So as you have this decay in the industrial and more value-added sectors in Brazil, you don't see the same trend in the African continent. You see actually either a stability in the imports of this very same products or a growth, which shows that the African economy is becoming much more sophisticated and is growing to a never seen scale and is developing at a very fast pace. And Brazil is not keeping up with his side of the relationship. So you see that since 2013, when Brazil-Africa trade reached its peak at 27 billion US dollars, you have an overall decay in Brazil-Africa trade, reaching as much as 7 billion of exports in 2019, and even lower in 2020 with the COVID-19 crisis. So we have a very negative scenario and a decoupling between the Brazilian and African economies in the short term, in the last half a decade. But as a way to map Brazilian and African relations and to delineate a way forward, a way of going from 2020 to 2030 in a more constructive way, it is important that Brazil and Africa have a decade of re-engagement, and this necessarily goes through this key concept of coordination, of coordinating mutual needs and solutions to forge more sustainable economic ties in the long run. Brazil needs to know what it has to offer. Africa needs to know what it requires for its economic development, and vice versa. And this coordination necessarily goes through as well with the rebuilding of these three pillars: the diplomatic will from the Brazilian side, the creation of public-private coalitions on the Brazilian side, and the understanding of what Brazil can supply to help African development and to construct prolific and profitable relationships for both sides. Brazilian and African economies are very much complementary, and they have a lot of potential for the integration of value chains. So it is always a win-win relationship for both sides. You have, as part of this effort of coordinating the work of the Brazil-Africa Institute itself, with the lack of high-level meetings and high-level summits between heads of state of South America or even Brazil and African countries, the Brazil-Africa Institute has been promoting for almost a decade now the Brazil-Africa Forum as a way of engaging and creating dialogue between different Brazilian and African actors from the public, private, and civil society sectors. Brazil-Africa Forum has had its 8th edition last year, and since 2019, since 2020, we have been trying to connect more and more the private sector on both sides, launching Brazil-Africa business and investment dialogues and roundtables that try to connect Brazilian business people with African business people, so they can know the opportunities and the challenges that they can face in either side, and what they can supply and what they demand to drive African economic integration to further levels, and to drive inter-Atlantic, South Atlantic relations to another level as well, to recapture the same assets and the same extent of economic relations that they had in between the 2000 and 2010. But this way forward requires diplomatic will. It requires a political and diplomatic effort that I'm sure that Brazil has, and Brazil needs to reshape its foreign policy a little bit to focus on recapturing African affairs and reconsidering African affairs inside its foreign policy agenda. Since 2019, you have the Mercosur European Union bi-regional trade agreement, which has sought to liberalize markets on both sides. And even though this has been a construct for nearly 20 years, almost 30 years in the making, the same thing can happen and should happen between Mercosur and the African Continental Free Trade Area. If you don't have a trade agreement right now, it is a very comprehensive and a very complex thing to do. You should at least have coordinating mechanisms that bring together Mercosur and AfCFTA high-level leaders and presidents, or even technical people on both sides, to form working groups and coordinate economic relations on both sides. And this must also come together with Brazilian efforts to build stronger and deeper economic relations with bilateral partners as well that are already in the top of Brazil's trade agenda, such as Algeria, Nigeria, Kenya, and Angola. And there are key economies to help Brazil to reinsert itself in different African regions, and to eventually negotiate trade agreements, or be the drivers of a Mercosur AfCFTA bi-regional commercial agreement. Brazil needs to reposition itself and build this economic relations triangle in the Atlantic, so it does not become an isolated economy as the world moves itself from Atlantic relations to Indo-Pacific relations with the BRI and other initiatives of the same nature. Brazil also needs to recapture and rebuild its public-private coalitions with different industry associations and agro-industrial associations, and restart its overall movement of driving Brazilian companies, be them large companies as they were inserted in the African continent in different African countries, be it with pushing small and medium enterprises from Brazil on different competitive sectors, such as agro-industrial products, agro-industrial machines, technology, communications technology, informatics, manufacturing, vehicles, airplanes, everything that Brazil has a competitive advantage in. It should push towards building stronger relationships with African countries, because value chains in Brazil and Africa are very much complementary and are very much have the potential to be integrated in a way, as I said, that can build win-win relationships rather than a win-lose or a zero-sum game relationships. You have a different status in terms of the coordination of supply and demand in Brazil and African countries. You have goods that do not necessarily meet or match in terms of their highest growth rate in the last few years. But if you have the adequate coordination, and if you have the necessary arrangements to coordinate these economic sectors, you can build bridges and trade linkages that even though you don't have the same sectors growing at the same pace, you can build a path for them to converge and grow in trade and investment relation in the medium and long term. So as you can see, this is something that is very much needs to be in the Brazilian agenda again, in order for it to restore the economic relations between Brazil and Africa. Africa has been surging and has been growing at an unprecedented rate. It has been leaving all other countries behind in terms of economic growth, population growth, and investment opportunities and trade opportunities. And it is not up to Africa to recapture its relationship with Brazil, but rather up to Brazil to try to see Africa again as a valuable partner and to reshape its priorities and its foreign policy to an extent that that can allow it to rebuild these economic relations. I heard something here in the presentation that I thought was very much interesting in this sense, that the composition of what is traded is also important. And Brazil-Africa trade has a composition that, as I said many times before, can lead to a win-win relationship. You can have the complementarity of different economic value chains, such as the agro-industrial sector and the food sectors that are booming in multiple African countries, so they can be self-sustainable in terms of food production and food security. Brazil has the experience, Brazil has the technology, and Brazil can contribute to the development of these value chains as well. You have the technology transfer of different agricultural specimens and technologies and biological goods that can be traded between Brazil and African countries. You have the development of different sectors from machines and electronics that are very much adaptable to the African context as well, due to similar climate and cultural conditions. And you also have the potentials for Brazil and African countries, as they are very much in the same levels of development, and they face the similar challenges and they face the similar struggles. You have the potential as well to exchange good practices and to exchange solutions and training in different areas, such as institutionalization of trade policies, macroeconomic policies, digital integration, infrastructural integration, and all those development imperatives that are much consolidated in the northern part of the world, but require a different understanding and a different impetus here in the global south. And Brazil and African countries are a perfect match for building this strong relationship that is not only built upon trade linkages, but is also built upon exchange of expertise, experience, and knowledge between both sides.
Thank you. Are you done?
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You made a lot of very important points. Basically, at the level of politics, we see that ideological changes in political parties can bring about a discontinuity, which is what has happened. But we also highlighted the fact that there can be a lot of complementarity between Brazil and several African countries. Of course, Brazil is engaging with many countries in Africa now. And then you highlighted the importance of integration with Mercosur, which I think is a very important point, that even as we start with the African Continental Free Trade Area, you need to look at what are the complementarity between this continental agreement and what is happening in Asia, and of course in South America. And you also talk about the possibility that Brazil has to contribute to structural transformation of African economy, which is what we are looking for actually, that it is not just to continue the traditional pattern of trade, that Africa continue to export raw materials to the other parts of the world, that in the context of the objective of AfCFTA, that there's need for structural transformation, which from the agro business sector, agro-allied industry, of which Brazil seems to have a kind of competitive advantage, that they can actually contribute to enhancing that sector in Africa. So thank you very much for this useful point. Now I call on the first discussant, Charles Ojubana, to give his 10 minutes presentation. We are running against time. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we are hearing you.
Okay, very good. I want to say that I'm glad to be part of this, and I want to thank all the presenters and moderators we've had before now, and all the discussants. The topic at hand is quite interesting, but let me also put on record that General Ishola Williams was also instrumental to having me on board. Just by way of introduction, I presently represent the Brazil Chamber of Commerce in Nigeria. And over the past 18 months, we've been trying to find sources of business partnership between Nigeria and Brazil. No thanks to COVID, we've had a lot of challenges, but thank God it's looking up right now. I really enjoyed the presentation of Yao Paulo, and I want to thank you for all the things you've said, especially bringing it out from the historical perspective of how the trade relations between Brazil and Africa has evolved over time. And I'm glad you were able to pinpoint the fact that perhaps from the policy level, the various heads of states, the presidents, and the policymakers at the highest level need to chip in to make this possible. Because like you and I do know, if there's a kind of foreign policy agenda or foreign policy support, diplomatic support to whatever businessmen want to do between these two economic blocks, it makes it a lot easier and a lot faster for results to be achieved. The other point I want to make is that, like the moderator did say, those days are gone when Africa was looked upon as just a provider of raw materials. Anything you need to do today in business must be a situation where both partners find a winning formula. Like Paulo said, it has to be a win-win situation. So in the case of Brazil and Africa, for instance, we have a lot of cultural advantages, a lot of historical linkages, which we can also bring to bear even in our trade and in our commerce. I want to talk about things like the music industry, the movie industry, the clothing industry. These are areas where Africa and Brazil has a lot of, identities that are similar. So I look forward as we move on to the days when we begin to have, we have a lot of Nigerian musicians who are doing very well on the international scene, making a lot of money, but they seem to collaborate only with maybe Americans or Europeans. Because of the cultural affinity we have with Brazil, I want to see a situation where, moving forward, we can see a lot of collaboration between Africa and Brazil in music, in movie making. The movie making, Nigeria has the third largest movie making industry in the whole world. So that is a gold mine that Brazil can also tap in. Yes, I know we have the advantages of, the disadvantage of language barrier, but that hurdle could easily be crossed by subtitling in Portuguese for your own audience. So then on the issue of the 2020 and 2030 re-engagement agenda, yes, I'm in support of it. The time has come, and I'm a firm believer that trade between third world countries, as they are called, does seem to benefit everybody more than the kind we used to have in the past, which was almost like a master-servant relationship. So there has to be mutual respect. There has to be something for everybody. Brazil needs some products from Africa, and of course, Africa needs a lot, particularly in terms of improving our the traders themselves and to
I think we lost Mr. Shaz. Let's hope he can reconnect. But I sent some questions through yesterday. Joe, maybe you want to reflect more on some of these questions, especially in the light of, are you back, sir? Oh yeah, please, you are unmute yourself. You are muted.
Yeah, I am back. Thank you.
Please continue.
Yes. So no, I was just rounding up, and I was saying that with what we're doing with the Chamber of Commerce in Nigeria right now, I think there are a lot of opportunities moving forward. And for the average business Brazilian who probably is tuned on to this, they need to understand that Africa is a gold mine waiting to be tapped. And there's a lot of collaboration for African countries in Brazil, and there's a lot to gain from each other. And like I emphasized earlier on, I personally want to see a situation where we tap into our cultural affinity, and that has been there over the years. Not many people know that in Brazil, for instance, there's a very strong Yoruba community. I've been to a part of Brazil, Salvador, where you can buy akara on the streets like you do in Lagos, where their clothing is the same like we used to have in the Brazilian quarters in Lagos, and they worship Yamoja, and some of the deities we also worship here in Nigeria. So that should count for something. And like I said, we can tap from the music, from the movie industry, promote these cultures, and bring our people together, and of course be able to tap onto the other opportunities that we have, especially in the agro-allied sector.
Thank you very much.
So let me pause for now, and maybe I can make further interventions when others have spoken. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And these are very useful interventions, and especially in the context of culture. Culture as
Prof, are you there?
Yes, I'm talking now. Especially in the context of culture as business, that a lot of cultural interaction between Nigeria and Nigeria, of course, and other African countries and Brazil, that in the context of the African Continental Free Trade Area, that this can be integrated as part of business, not just commodities, that is, which is under what is called services. So, it holds huge potential for Africa economic development and, of course, Brazil economic development. So you also talk about the issue of agribusiness, and I want to probe further. Maybe Joe will be able to help us about how Brazil can contribute to this sector. Africa has a lot of comparative advantage in agriculture, but that has not been optimized because of a lot of challenges with storage facilities, adding value to this, especially in the context of the structural transformation. I think it would be a great thing if Brazilian companies can engage more with Africa in adding value to those agricultural products. How do you want to contribute more to that, to shed light on this?
Yeah, absolutely. I would just want to first address something that Dr. Charles mentioned on the creative industry, and then I'll go to the agro-industrial value chain. I think that this is something key to understanding also Brazil-Africa relations, and this is also something that needs to be built upon to create a stronger relationship between Brazil and Africa. The creative industry and cultural ties between Brazil and Africa are very visible and apparent. But I think that, if I'm not mistaken, the African Union key theme for 2021 is actually cultural heritage and cultural industry. So this is something that Brazil needs to take advantage of and tap into as well. We all know that Nollywood industry is a very prolific industry for movies, for music, for creating celebrities. And I think that Brazil needs to find ways to collaborate with African artists and to expose its culture to different African countries, not only Lusophone countries like Cabo Verde or Angola or Mozambique, but as you said, break the language barrier and create collaborations that can tie this African side and Brazilian side, in which Afro-Brazilian culture can emerge as something new and something very prolific and that can be consumed everywhere, not only here, but also in African countries. And I think that the Afro-Brazilian cultural industry here in Brazil and the African industry here in Brazil is actually booming in the last few years. I think that you have You have this Black artists here in Brazil recapturing their heritage and recapturing their African roots and trying to produce music and movies and web series and series for to tackle this theme of Africa and African heritage, African culture, and their own family roots that date back to the African continent. And this is something that Brazil can learn from Africa as well. How to recapture this African heritage in a way that the black community in Brazil, which is over 50% of the population, can actually regain its own identity and can be more prolific and can be more productive in the creative industry. So we don't have only a white and privileged people booming in the creative industry in Brazil. So I think that this is a theme that is asking to be tapped upon very much, as you said, and in those last few years, and it needs to receive political and economic attention. Regarding the agro-industrial value chain, I think that this is by far the sector that has the most potential for trade and investment relations between Brazil and African countries. It also it even eclipses to some extent the other sectors like technology and digital communications sectors for Brazil and Africa, Brazil and African trade. I see this as I see 3 points that can be the pillars, so to say, that sustain stronger and more productive Brazil-Africa relations in the agro-industrial value. One of them is the strong industry that Brazil have for machines and agricultural inputs, and such as fertilizers or agricultural equipments. They are very much adaptable and they're very much ready to be used in different African countries because of natural similarities, soil similarities, and overall climate conditions. So this is something that is pretty much the same as you would need to use in Brazil, you can use in different African countries. So this is an advantage regarding other products produced in Asia or Europe or in North American countries. So this can even reduce costs and reduce, for instance, training costs or adaptation costs that you have when linking these two industries. The other one is the use of modern technologies such as biotechnology and scientific discoveries in Brazil for different varieties of crops such as cassava, maize, beans, corn, rice, that you can use, that you are using some varieties here in Brazil that are pest resistant or they're more resistant to drought, that require less water, require more water, and that can be adapted to different African contexts as well. You have a very strong experience here in the Brazilian Agricultural Research Corporation, which is a state-led company which goes by the name of Embrapa. They have offices spread in Africa. If I'm not mistaken, they have one in Accra, and they're very strong. I'd say they're the key company in the world that produces more advanced varieties of different crops and technologies for agricultural production. And this can be a point of convergence with African countries as well, using the biological advancements and scientific advancements to adapt these crops or to use these different crops that are more resistant and that are more productive, that have greater yields and outputs in African countries, so that you can help these countries to achieve a better position in terms of food security. And the third one is actually the technical training component, because you have people working here in Brazil. You have socioeconomic inequalities, you have working inequalities here in Brazil that are very much a reflection of what you have in African countries as well. So if you have people that are capacitated to use and to produce food in both regions, in Brazil and African countries, with pretty much the same techniques that they can use in different contexts, you can have people that are more productive, that have a better well-being, that have more employability, and which can overall contribute to the economic growth of their countries in a much more sustainable and long-term fashion. You can even think of this technical training and this technical components as being a key driver of achieving food security, because people can then contribute to overall domestic production that can feed them, their families, and their communities, but also even grow to achieving greater yields that can lead to the establishment of new businesses, new companies, and sometimes even with the adequate institutional support, economic support, such as credit, etc., and the technologies achieve conditions of exporting their yields at a lower cost to different African countries or even other countries in the world. So I'd say that these three components are key for the approximation of Brazil and African countries in the agro-industrial value. The equipments, the technologies, and machinery that can be adaptable in the two regions, the biotechnology and the scientific advancements that can be also adaptable and used in two countries, in the two regions, and the technical components and technical training and knowledge and know-how and abilities that can be used mutually and interchangeably as well.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we don't have the presenter for Russia, but just to highlight what I said earlier on, that Russia is actively engaged in Africa on security issues in particular, which to me is very fundamental. And I would want the participant to find a way of engaging with this, because if we don't control the supply of arms, and I'm not accusing Russia here, it might undermine the possibility of achieving the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. But of course, the country is also engaged in the mining sector, in the power sector. I was particularly interested in the program that Russia is planning for Ethiopia to establish that power sector there. And given the fact that this remains a big challenge in Africa, electricity, lack of access to electricity, affects small-scale business, affect big businesses. I would think that that kind of intervention can complement other the African focus and external engagement, like the US Power Africa program. I think EU also has something around that. I think this intervention, if well managed, can help to address this problem. But we want to know from the participant, what are your views about the engagement of these countries? I saw some chat here from Victoria saying that she agreed with Charles on the issue of creative industry in Africa, but of course, her emphasis will be on agriculture and processing, which Joe, if I pronounce your name very well, has rightly talked about. But what General Shola will then also talk about the present situation of business linkages for industrialization, especially manufacturing between Brazilian industry and MSMEs in Africa. He wants Joe to answer that question. But before that, I want to see if we have anybody with any perspective on Russia from the audience. Yes, do we have anybody who want to chip in on Russia and what the role do you think they can play, or what any disruptive effect? Because from my own perspective, of course, China is not the only country supplying arms, but at 35%, I think that is very significant. And I'm wondering what thoughts we can share from this in the context of the AfCFTA.
Yeah, Professor.
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
I just want to underscore that the reality that you stated is one side of the equation. The other one is that even those arms that find their ways in our countries are also penetrating countries through transit routes, in a way that will be stunning to any observer. I spent about half a day in Mombasa port observing things because, again, part of my work in trade facilitation is customs coordination. And what we see repeatedly is that sometimes when you have a product and the origination documents say these are 20 tons of plantain, when they get to the destination, they become small arms, they become ammunitions, bullets in the same thing, still covered by the same documents. So now we will not blame any country for that, Russia, China, anybody, but for the fact that the process of clearing, inspecting of goods transboundary, unless we pay attention to them, will affect the implementation of CFTA, because countries are beginning to say, look, this free trade thing that you're talking about is bringing arms to my country. And unless you can figure that out, we are not going to pay attention. This is why we have done two things at ECA. One, in collaboration with the African Union, we are undertaking an analytical study of transit systems. We are looking at all regs, all the corridors, looking at what is the transit mode, how rigorous is the inspection, the collusion of officials, all of this stuff. And we are going to be presenting the most optimal, again, to the African heads of states for consideration. Secondly, we are now thinking about using blockchain technology to kind of reduce the human contact in the process of clearing in customs, because that is where we see that there is a problem. It is not spirits that are changing things in transit. It is not spirits that are changing plantains into AK-47. It is somebody there, and it is because they have access to it. So we are working on that too, and we'll be getting in touch with many of the people in this session, in this seminar, just to kind of accompany us as we do those two things. I just wanted to say that, and thank you again for good moderation. Over.
Thank you very much, sir. I really appreciate the fact that the ECA is already working on this. And I was talking to the general yesterday. Maybe this will be the next webinar, if time permits, and we can put it together, that we need to address the issue of small arms and security in Africa. As it is, without political stability, all these things we're talking about economic partnership agreement, about AfCFTA, none of them can work. So it's very critical. I have somebody here who said he wants to talk about Russia. Please, I have a few suggestions on AfCFTA, internal cross-national independent expert. Okay, so Mr. Olugbenga Adeolu, please can you unmute him? Olugbenga Adeolu. I'm not sure if I can unmute him from here. Eden,
yeah, let me try and get in touch with the colleagues. It will be unmuted shortly.
All right. Then Dr. Juliana also want to talk about, yeah, Dr. Juliana also need to be unmuted.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes,
Hello?
but Olugbenga Adeolu will speak first, then you can follow.
No problem.
John, over the meet you have unmuted.
Yeah, I think, yes.
I am unmuted and I'll wait for my time at your convenience, sir.
No, please go ahead now.
Okay, I will rush this in about a minute. And for the sake of relevance to what's being said presently, I'll just take a few seconds. The thing about Russia and arms in Africa, let's not forget the angle where it's our governments trying to deal with internal insurgencies and terrorism that approach Russia G to G for arms purchases, which they were denied by Western sources. In desperate situations to save national integrity, territorial integrity, peace, and security, this has become an unfortunate event that is going on, and I don't know if it's for our benefit or not. Straight to the point I mentioned on the African Free Trade Intelligence Unit. I want to quickly say this, that I have listened to so many contributions on this program, in this webinar, and I worry about the aspect of how we are able to manage something that is new and novel to Africa, a globalized intracontinental trade agreement is new to us, and we have not experimented with this before. Now it's happening. To prevent a stage where there is near future chaos, confusion, collapse because of the common nonchalant or sometimes ineffective, inefficient management of programs that have public sector or government control, I would like to suggest, and I don't know how you all as experts and people with the right connections can make this happen. What has been going on here in the past 2 days or 3 days? Can we have it recreated like a permanent structure in the African Free Trade, Continental Free Trade headquarters, where there is a created unit, an intelligence unit that will handle research and intelligence inside the headquarters of the African Free Trade, premises. They are located in Ghana and will yet be independent of government control. It will be like a think tank, like we have Brookfield, Rand, the Canadian Global Affairs, and their role is to pull experts who are employed on merit, may I say, funded like the BBC, where the government doesn't give them the money and control them. Maybe there'll be donors who will fund them and they will be able to independently operate like a think tank that will gather intelligence on international trade, that will study trade agreements of maybe NAFTA, of advanced countries who have done this before us, sit down as a body, review policy, make suggestions, do investigations, build a database as if you have StatsCan building a statistical database to provide vital information that they will process, and also have a language unit where we have experts who speak Chinese and can interpret properly a Chinese agreement, a Russian agreement, a Portuguese agreement from Brazil, etc., and pick specific cases like NAFTA, which has become USMCA, CETA, which Canada has with the EU, and study all these agreements. That's their work every day. And from it, produce vital advice, recommendations, and useful information for all the countries and for the headquarters to make sure that what we have built will not in the future collapse. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for that thoughtful suggestion. I'm sure the ECA is listening, and if African Union is here, I'm sure they are also listening. They are the implementer of this, and I'm sure they will give it a serious consideration. This is very important. Dr. Juliana, please.
Okay, good evening. Thank you very much, Professor Samuel, for your permission to speak. Distinguished guest, all protocols observed. I would like just to make 3 insightful comments about Russia. One, I studied in Paris in France, and I was in a university where we had children working in the Russian government, whether their parents were working in the chemical industry or in, whether they're working directly with the Russian president. And what I noticed with them is that they have a lot of knowledge in chemical industry, and in innovation. So for me, personally, I would take it positively. I would rather look at the positive Russian side, or looking at the history of Russia and communism, and and all the NATO and the military, the heavy military experience that they have. And Russia is a superpower in terms of military. It's got one of the best militaries in the world. If you look at whether you're looking at Russia is the best, we have the United States of America, we have Japan, and a few other countries that have a very strong military. So I think we could borrow from, as in what a professor just mentioned, from the intelligence of Russia, because they're very good at gathering intelligence, and that's what we could borrow in terms of bringing for them adding value other than the negativity of arms. And secondly, what I'd like to mention is that when I was coming back, I had personal effects shipped from Le Havre in France, the port of France, it had to go to Douala in Cameroon and then come to Mombasa port in Mombasa. And by the time the seal I put in Le Havre, by the time my personal effect container was getting to Mombasa port, a 20-foot container, it didn't have the original seal from Le Havre. So we cannot blame anybody on, like it was said, anybody in terms of arms trading. I think it's supposed to reflect on different interests. You might have in a country different interests in terms of in the government system and leadership. Every regime has its own interest. So if a regime has an interest in arms, depending on what they want to use them from, whether it is insurgency or militia, or you can even have a different section of government or even business people trading in arms, whatever interest they bear. So I think from my point of view would be that let's tap into the positive aspects of Russia. And lastly, we had President Vladimir Putin the other day invite African presidents to his country, and our own president, His Excellency President Uhuru Muigai Kenyatta, among other leaders from Zimbabwe and Angola. They all attended this meeting, and it is a positive inclination that Russia is interested in holding, whether multilateral or bilateral, in collaborating and cooperating with Africa. And English is not their strong point. Just like China or any other country that speak whatever other language, so does Africa. We have our own languages, but I think we should embrace them. I look at them very positively, and I believe they will add fundamental values in terms of technology and innovation when it comes to the AfCFTA overall. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our concern, as we have listened to the various presenters, is what is the value that Africa can get from all these partners, and your point is well made. I'm particularly happy that Dr. Adeyinka was saying that blockchain is being used now to trace arms, and like I said, I'm not castigating Russia. They are not the only ones supplying arms to Africa. I agree with you. A lot of benefits can come, especially from their power sector, from the mining. But I noted here yesterday that there's a need for moving from extraction of mineral to adding value through what we call beneficiation. And I think if Russia can contribute that to the agenda of structural transformation in Africa, that would be great. General Shola has another question for Joan. And he was also asking about the lack of interest of the present government in Africa. I don't know whether your position allow you to talk about that, Joan.
Yes, thank you. Well, as I said before, there has actually been a general retraction of Brazilian foreign policy in many arenas, not only in Africa, but Africa has been historically on a second level of Brazilian foreign policy. It was brought to Brazilian attention mostly on 1960s for like 10 years. And then in the 1970s and 80s, it remained on the second level. And from 1990s and especially during Lula's presidency, it came to the first level and became almost like the central actor of Lula's foreign policy. It opened many embassies and in Africa. It coordinated heavily with different heads of state and made multiple presidential visits to different African countries. I think he reached something like 30 presidential visits to different countries. But since, to be fair, completely fair, since President Dilma Rousseff's presidency, Brazil's foreign policy has been retracting, slowly retracting, and its foreign policy to Africa has been following this very same trend. It has been a half a decade of crisis for Brazil domestically and for Brazil's international agency as well. So yeah, I don't see much of an interest since 2015 of the Brazilian government towards Africa. It has closed some of its embassies in the continent. It has stopped coordinating at a higher level with different African countries. Aside from, say, Egypt, which is our largest African trade partner, Nigeria, which is undeniably a very strong economic actor globally, and South Africa, which is our most traditional political partner, so to say. Brazil has had no interest whatsoever in terms of its foreign policy in coordinating in bilateral themes with, even with West African countries, which are historically the ones that have benefited the most with Brazilian diplomatic goodwill, so to say. You had many Lusophone countries in West Africa. You had the Community for Lusophone Countries, which has not received much attention from Brazilian foreign policy for the last 5 years. You used to have a South Atlantic Peace and Cooperation Zone called ZOPACAS, which has also been deactivated. Has not received much attention since 2015. You had this South America-Africa Summit, which has not received any attention since 2013. So yeah, I would say that this reflects much of a redirection of Brazilian foreign policy towards countries of the North, with its intent to join the OCDE, with its intent to rebuild a strategic partnership with European countries, with the UK and USA. And this is very unfortunate because it creates a myopic vision of Brazil to African countries, and African countries don't really need Brazil to achieve development, but they could use Brazil experience and they could use Brazilian agency to grow together. And this is something very sad. This lack of priority to Africa in Brazil foreign policy is indeed a reality. And hopefully it will change in the next year with hopefully a change in this overall trend in political terms in Brazil.
Yeah, thank you very much. The other question from the general is about are there linkages between
John, afternoon. John Obajemin is still waiting.
Oh, sorry, I didn't know.
John Obajemin from Nigeria still waiting.
Oh, sorry about that. I'll call you shortly. So is there any linkage between small and medium scale enterprises in Africa and Brazil? Do you have that? Can you share some thoughts with us?
Yeah, I think that there is a linkage between Brazilian small and medium enterprises, but it stays under its real potential. Brazil-Africa trade for the last 10, 20 years was much based upon some very large pillars that if they collapsed, Brazil-Africa trade collapsed as a consequence, because you had mainly Brazilian multinationals from the food sector, from the mining industry, from the vehicles, cars and trucks industry, and Brazil's large multinational companies from the oil sector, such as Petrobras, and also agro industry. So aside from this, say 5 key sectors and that are responsible for that has this Brazilian multinational companies responsible for the trade between Brazil and Africa, there's not really much significance in terms of Brazil's small and medium enterprises trading with African countries, which is very unfortunate because you have a very strong experience here in Brazil and Brazilian SMEs in themes, as I said before, such as digital inclusion, digital technologies, communication, very strong startups and fintechs and martechs markets, and they could use this growing African market, this growing and young and ever technology advancement African market to create and build more sustainable ties in the long term that are not dependent upon a few large actors as it is now.
All right, thank you very much. Mr. John Obajimi, please.
Yeah, good afternoon, the panelists and everyone. Thank you, Mr. Joapalo, for all your inputs. We've learned a lot from you. However, I want to let you know that the advent of free continental trade agreement in Africa, one of the focuses is to reduce the like Mr. Samuel said, to reduce the incidences of selling raw materials to outside Africa, leaving African people in poverty. The desire is how to bring Brazil, how to bring America, UK, and other, how to facilitate them to bring the industry to be established within Africa, whereby so that there is a need for us to build the production within Africa in such a way that it will help us to equally reduce, through the technology transfer, it can reduce poverty and still, and there is a low-hanging fruit for Brazil and other countries who are willing to come and establish companies in Africa. And that comes through the rules of origin, whereby the products that you produce within Africa have higher opportunity for sales within Africa. So I asked this question, I pushed this question to you, Mr. Joapalo. Brazil, are you people interested in bringing companies, establishing companies within Africa to boost production and take advantage of the benefit of sales that will come from the rules of origin? Or your interest is still on taking raw materials away from Africa and bring down the finished products? Thank you.
Thank you, John. No, I would say that this is not Brazil's interest at all. You had yes, Brazilian companies that are acting in the extractive industry, such as Vale and Petrobras. But this is not really the focus of Brazil-Africa trade, and I think that this should not be the focus of Brazil-Africa trade for the next few years. Brazil is also very rich in terms of natural resources and minerals and oil, and this should not be the driver of Brazil-Africa trade, to be completely honest. It should be, Brazil-Africa trade should be driven upon what Brazil can offer in terms of intermediate goods, in terms of investments, and in terms of installment of industries and contribution to industries in Africa itself. So Africa can drive its own development, and Brazil can win with it and from it. Brazil has, as I said, a strong experience and very large industries that can indeed contribute with African development by adding specific inputs and complementing African value chain in specific areas. For instance, if you have the food industry, the agricultural value chain in the food industry, the intent of Brazil should not be to export or to import raw materials and export processed food. It should be rather on providing African countries with the adequate materials, inputs, and machinery, and installing the necessary industries in these African countries so they can produce with Brazilian material and with Brazilian machinery their own more complex machinery and their own agriculture and food value chains that can supply food for their own countries and to export to other African countries or to the rest of the world. The same thing goes with infrastructural development. Brazil has a strong presence in terms of the steel industry and cement industry. So Brazil should contribute with technologies, with industry and industrial capacity to African countries so they can build their own, so we can establish joint ventures or public-private partnerships in African countries so we can produce with indigenous capacities and with the work of African countries and African specialists and engineers, the necessary materials and components and inputs for the development of infrastructure, be it roads or railroads, or even the construction of vehicles. You have a strong presence of companies from the southern region of Brazil, such as Marco Polo and Rondon, in different African countries that produce vehicles such as trucks and cars and buses to the African industry to create this linkage of African manufacturers. You also have a strong potential for Brazil to be involved in the microelectronics and microchips and communications industry as well. Brazil has a strong presence in the computer manufacturing industry, cell phone manufacturing industry. You have a strong industrial pole in the region of, in the Amazon region in Manaus. And these technologies that are developed here indigenously in Brazil can help the installment of different industries in African countries that can produce cell phones, that can produce telephones, that can produce computers, tablets, and smartphones, and that can supply the African market from within the African continent itself. So this should be the focus of the Brazilian trade policy towards Africa, not extracting raw materials. And I don't think that that's the case right now. We do import lots of raw materials from Africa. That is a fact, but that should not be the case. And I think that should recede, but rather providing the necessary equipment, inputs, and technologies for African industries and value chains to develop themselves indigenously with the use of indigenous capacities, and provide and supply goods for the rest of the African countries according to their own competitive and comparative advantages.
All right, thank you very much. I wish President Lula will win the next election and make you the vice president. And then you can implement all this agenda for Africa. So we have one or two more questions, and then we conclude this session.
Okay, sorry, let me ask another question, please. In the area of security, you know, just like you said the other time, Prof, my concern has been that there is a fear of escalation of insecurity within Africa as a result of the protocols on free movement. Now, Apollo, what ideas do you think can help Africa to prevent escalation of insecurity as a result of free movement that is provided by AfCFTA? Thank you.
Thank you, John. I'm not really a specialist in security studies or African security per se, but I think that something that Brazil has implemented here, and I'm taking our own experience as an example, and maybe that can be used as a model, of course, in a much larger scale. You have a gigantic scale in Africa, but something that Brazil has implemented here with Mercosur, which allows for the free movement of people between Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay, and Argentina, is actually a harmonization of documents, a harmonization of different identification measures and security measures in the borders that can allow for an easier trespassing of passage of people between borders. Of course, the security issues are a little bit different between South America and Africa. In Africa, you have much more of a problem of domestic insurgents and jihadist terrorism, which is not the case in Brazil. In Brazil and in South America, you have another problem, which is the narcotics trade and narcotics and drug trafficking between the Amazon region and Amazon countries. So I think that in the sense of domestic security and enhancing domestic apparatus of security to address these issues, there's not really much of a convergence in terms of addressing the root causes of each of these problems, because they're very much different. But I think that there can be some institutional dialogue and some technical level dialogue between agencies from Brazil or from Mercosur and agencies from the AfCFTA to address and to exchange experiences in how to harmonize borders, how to adapt and use different tools and technologies to address this cross-border issues that exist. You have, I know for a fact that in Agenda 2063, you have as a goal, and as a result of AfCFTA as well, to harmonize passports and to create a free movement of people all across Africa. So I think that having this overarching goal in mind, there can be some institutional dialogue, and I think that this could be maybe the starting point for collaborating in this security aspect between Mercosur and AfCFTA. I think that there's more of a convergence in security terms between Brazil and South American countries and African countries in terms of maritime security. And that is why Brazil has invested some of its efforts, diplomatic efforts, to creating a South Atlantic peace zone, because I think it makes much more sense in terms of coastal security, anti-piracy policies, and overall security of its maritime borders. I think that yes, is one of the areas in which Brazil can contribute more towards helping and collaborating with African security in general.
Right, thank you very much. It's been a very enlightening session. I'll just summarize some of the things I pick, especially related to Brazil, on which we have a full paper presented, is the fact that the Africa and Brazil can actually engage on win-win basis, not exploitative basis, that Brazil can contribute to structural transformation in Africa through support with technology, with agro-business, with cooperation in innovation and training, and then in creative industry, boosting, using the competitive and comparative advantages between the two regions to boost trade through the creative industry. And to say that there could be linkages between Mercosur and the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. And in the context of Russia, that Russia can also support Africa, can work with Africa for structural transformation. And I mean, we talk about the issue of avoiding arms that can end up with non-state actors, and that the ECA is already working on this using blockchain technology. And then we had of the need for an intelligence unit to be established within AfCFTA that can gather data, analyze data, interpret data with various third countries that are engaging with Africa. So I want to thank the presenters and the discussants and the panelists and of course the audience for a very lively session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Prof. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, Wow, and all the excellent people who added to, who intervened very effectively. Yeah, I'm trying to. The next session that we have, the next session will be the 1 second, please. I am having some issues here. Yeah. Okay. Now we are the session now where we have to consider the policy recommendations from this webinar. We have a very diligent rapporteur who has really put together the summary and the recommendations according to sessions. So what we will do, so in order to be able to go to session 10 quickly, what we will do is circulate this, and I have them in I have the whole document in my hand, 5 pages. What we will do is kind of circulate this amongst the partners, and then go ahead and forward it to every registered participant. The idea is for you to be able to review everything, review the recommendations, review the sessions. If you recall anything that was discussed and that we have inadvertently left out, you call our attention to it. And then within the next week or so, week or two, you should be able to have this as a matter of record, so that we will give you another 1 week to get back to us, point us in the right direction if we missed out anything. But what I would just want to say is that nothing extraneous will be entertained, because that will be an insult to you. The things that we will entertain in this are things that were discussed and that were agreed to, because we are planning to take this at the policy level to the African Union so that implementation can start. So that is the end of session 9. So may I then call on Professor Olon Toba and Professor Teddy Sami, to take us through the last session, which is the authors workshop. Now, just a preface to that. As I've said over the last couple of days, our ambition is to develop the very fine submissions at this webinar into a book. So we will be inviting presenters to kind of develop their presentation, upgrade it into publishable material, so that we can take it through the process of review and publication. So it is for that reason that we thought about an authors workshop as the last session of this webinar. So all presenters, please stay on while others may excuse themselves if they want to. Thank you. Professor Lauren Toba, I think we are in the last session.
Thank you very much, Professor Sami. You want to take the first step?
No, I think I will let you go ahead. My sense is that we should probably wait until the attendees have left. I see that many are still here. They don't have to stay, because none of what we're going to discuss will be helpful to them. So if someone can actually wait or make sure that the attendees have left, then we'll continue the conversation.
Yeah, you are correct. I think that, we should be able to do that. Let me tell the colleagues to, well, I can see people leaving already.
Yeah, but I just want to thank them as well for being here today.
Yeah, and they will get the reports anyway, so.
Rebecca, we thank you very much. You did a great job.
Yes. Thank you very much, Rebecca. We'll be in touch with you.
Thank you, guys. Yeah. We still have about 26. No, let me see. We don't need, Prof, we don't need the interpreters, do we? We don't need the interpreters right
No,
now.
I speak French fluently, so if there's any issue with English,
Okay.
please ask me questions. I can answer in French, and I speak French.
Yeah, I'm just thinking whether we can excuse them or whether we should just still retain them. Perhaps we should retain them. Let's retain them because
Sure.
But we may have some of our presenters who presented in French, so that they will do the work too. All right. We have panelists 21, and the attendees 25. I don't know what that number
Can the
means.
IT people, because people may have just left their connections on and
Yeah.
around.
Okay. Let's. Yeah.
Yinka, this is Aiden. So you want me to remove participants from the
all the attendees? Yes.
Attendees. Yes, I can.
The attendees. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And I hope some speakers have not left.
Yeah, it's possible that some left. We will just have to find. Yeah, I'm sure some left.
Yeah.
But we will, especially our colleagues from the European Union delegation, I'm sure.
Yes. But I can see San is still here, Sam Bilal is still here.
Excellent. Yeah. San is here.
Yes. And it usually happens with the experience with students during online teaching. Some people will just sign on and they are not there. So,
so we have Francis is here. Wale Ogenkola is here. Lugbenga. So Lugbenga.
I don't think so. Yeah,
No.
Maybe he just signed. Maybe it's okay.
Yeah.
I am here. Olugbenga Delu is here. Sorry to unmute myself.
Okay. Yeah. Were you a presenter? Sorry.
No. I was attending, and I am still attending. I think people should be leaving now, I guess.
That's
so
right. Yeah.
My welcome.
Yeah. No. Thank you very much. You will get the report. You will get it.
Thank you very much, sir.
All right.
Yeah, I see the numbers trickling down now, so we're very close.
Yes.
Bear with us for a few more minutes.
Okay. There's Bart Amma, James Gathy. These are presenters. Then we have San is here. Yeah. I think we are probably the only person I see here is Olugbenga, who is about to leave.
Mm-hmm. And may I suggest for those of you who are here for the panelists, please turn on your cameras. It's a small group. If you can, if you have a bandwidth, I like to see who I'm speaking to. Usually, it's much better.
General Williams is having problems, so I'm going to put him on my phone here so that he will be able to follow.
Okay. Okay, I think we can start. I mean, in the interest of time, I know people are in different time zones and it's probably getting late in other places. I guess Professor Oloruntoba and myself just wanted to have a quick chat with everyone who's presented, and some of you have discussed papers in the last few days. We've enjoyed it. We've enjoyed the conversation, and we are currently exploring the possibility of producing either an edited volume with one of the leading publishers or maybe a special issue of a peer-reviewed journal, where some of the papers that were presented over the last 3 days would be published there. Of course, there's a challenge in terms of space. If we go with a book, I think it's a bit more flexible because you can put more chapters in a book. Usually journals have restrictions in terms of the number of papers that they accept. So that can be trickier. So ultimately it will depend on how many of you decide to submit a paper based on what you had discussed. Our view on this is that we would give people about 4 months from now to produce something. I mean, we can discuss these deadlines. I think ultimately ECA and others would probably have to chime in. We, of course, are both academics, so, and we're not the ones writing the papers, so it's easier for us to say, okay, we want this in 4 months, but we're also conscious of the fact that people may require more time. I guess we also wanted to make sure that if it is going to be published, that it should be based on existing work, but not replicate what you've already done, because that can create issues for publishers down the road. So yes, many of you have worked on these issues over the years, so you have a lot of experience. You've probably written about these topics extensively. So we would strongly encourage you to build on what you've done, as opposed to rewriting what you've done. So you can certainly draw from existing work. In terms of the paper, I mean, it's a pretty standard format that many of you will be used to, having a section about the problematic or the question that you're looking at, using existing studies. Those can be empirical, they can be qualitative, they can be case studies, and then, analyzing the problem and proposing recommendations. Over the last 3 days, we've seen, some controversial issues emerge. I think, I can, for example, mention 2 of them. This idea of going alone versus negotiating as a bloc, I think, is a theme that comes up time and time again. And related to this aspect is this issue of countries having very different interests. I think, San, you made a good point earlier that there's nothing in the AfCFTA that prevents countries from negotiating with third parties bilaterally. But then, as we have seen yesterday,